This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop. And the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies. And fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Oh my god, it's never going to end.
Well, yeah, pretty much. All right, so one hopes that the Japanese manga industry is indeed never going to end, Don. Or at least, if it does end, it ends in a spectacular way. But I'd prefer it not to end because, well, manga. And that's our topic for today, folks. Today we're going to be talking about manga. Or more precisely, we're going to be continuing on from our last long epic episode about manga, which only got halfway through the story. So settle down, strap in, and let's turn our Wayback Machine to the 1980s to continue our journey through the history of manga. All right, so 1980 hits, and Japan is in a boom. This is the great boom time for Japan, perhaps actually considered one of Japan's greatest boom, peaceful eras. I mean, this is kind of the point where Japan is where China is right now, or was a couple years ago, where everyone is like filthy, stinking rich. People are happy. Banks are profitable. Everyone's, Japan is basically buying the world at this point. At least that's what the American newspaper is telling us. It'll be a few years before the movie Gung Ho comes out for an obscure 80s reference that someone can go look up, or you can check our show notes at obeythedna.com for that reference. But Japan is basically ruling the world economically. In fact, it's kind of diversifying because they have just so much money at this point.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, their own manga industry is flourishing. How is it flourishing, Don?
Quickly.
Yes, I imagine it is.
Well, this is the time a lot of people think of when you look at the Japanese comics. The top sellers are in what is it? There's some of them are selling 6 or 7 million copies a week.
Shonen Jump would be selling. Hold on, just a sec here. I will tell you.
About 4 million.
We're hitting in 1980. Shonen Jump, which is the top selling Japanese manga. We briefly touched on it before, but Shonen Jump should best be referred to as the Marvel Comics of Japan. I think I referred to it that way in the last episode that we recorded as well. So basically, you can look at manga's health by looking at Shonen Jump in a lot of ways. At least in terms of mainstream manga. Shonen Jump is the manga. And anyway, so in 1980, it hits 3 million copies a week. This is weekly Shonen Jump. So that's 3 million copies a week going out. Yeah. By the end of the 1980s, it will be clocking in a little over 5 million copies a week. Yeah. And that's not its peak, by the way, folks. It hits its peak in the 1990s, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
So in 1980, Shonen Jump is doing damn well. And they have a wide variety of content. A lot of it at this point, if I recall right, is an interesting mix where some of it's influenced by the Gekiga that we talked about before, the dramatic pictures, at least in terms of style. Yeah. So you've got comics coming out like, for example, Fist of the North Star was a super popular one that came out in the early 80s. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, Fist of the North Star, and this was the pitch that the creator came up with, what if we took the Road Warrior, but it starred Bruce Lee instead of Mad Max? And that was the pitch that they worked with. That literally was the pitch, apparently. I was reading about that.
That makes sense.
And that's exactly how... And it plays out exactly how you might expect, except with 10 times the gore and 20 times the testosterone. Fist of the North Star is awesome. I love Fist of the North Star, but it is like it's like the Twilight for guys. It's just pure testosterone. The only thing that perhaps has more testosterone than Fist of the North Star is another 80s title, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Yeah, that's true.
In fact, looking at Weekly Shonen Jump during the early 80s, you see there's the interesting dichotomy, which I just almost referred to there before, where there's these Gekiga, like high testosterone, high action manga, which run the gambit from Fist of the North Star to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And of course, we've even City Hunter is also coming out during the early 80s as well.
Yeah.
Although it's kind of in a weird bridge one, because then you've got the slightly more cartoony stuff as well. In fact, in some ways, I would argue the 80s are an interesting period because they're kind of a period of everything. Like in terms of manga, you can find cartoony stuff, you can find serious stuff, you can find lighthearted stuff and dark stuff, and you can find a bit of everything going on. Like it really is an era of, I would say, experimentation. I really would. I think that they're trying a little bit of everything and willing to experiment. Like if you see Shonen Jump in the modern era, which we'll talk about a little later, but just to give a fast forward view, I would say that the majority of the stuff in Shonen Jump all looks very similar. It has what you could be called a Shonen Jump style. Whereas in the 70s and definitely in the 80s, it was much more experimental. They were kind of just trying almost everything. If it involved boys action and boys loved it, they printed it. And boy, did they print a lot of stuff.
Yeah, the two things that happened there, why you had so much experimentation going on in the 80s, and we're just kind of getting to the beginning of that, was you had the bubble economy. So there was money. People had money to spend on entertainment. And what you had coming from like the earlier periods, comic books in Japan had a huge audience. And that huge audience meant you had a bunch of different kinds of readers. Like here in North America in the 80s, when the 80s boom took off, the one everybody knows of, the Marvel, the DC one, it was mostly males, like say 13 to 25, I think was the age that were your audience. So every comic that came out started kind of veering that way. And you could tell if you compared that to the first boom of the 80s, which was like the independent boom, where you had more variety, you had more, you had people drawn from the undergrounds, you had people drawn from like the strips of the 50s, you had people doing, there was a lot of like European style cerebral science fiction, and then that kind of, after the black and white glut, everything became superheroes. Because it was a certain demographic that took off as the fans. Whereas in Japan, you had young, you had old, you had male, you had female. One of the things that you have to keep in mind too, Shonen Jump in the 80s was the top selling comic, but there were hundreds of other ones. And some of them, there were a lot, like a second string book was still doing like 2 million copies a month. And it got so crazy. You had, there would be, and again, to reiterate for anyone coming in, a Japanese weekly comic book is like a phone book.
Yep.
And it's got like 1 or 2 chapters from like 10 to 20 different stories.
Yep.
You had those coming out weekly that would be Pachinko comics. It was nothing but like Pachinko comics. And there'd be dramatic ones, there'd be comedic ones, there'd be serious ones, there'd be soap opera. But it's Pachinko. Pachinko, for anyone who doesn't know, it's kind of like a cross between a pinball and a slot machine.
Yeah.
And they would do comics on that. Like, and it was just because you had such a huge diverse audience. Pachinko was super popular, especially with, say, like older and middle-aged people. And there were enough of them reading that you could put out a whole weekly anthology that was nothing but stories about people playing Pachinko, and they would come up with weird variety. And there were so many topics like that.
Yeah. And there'd be golf ones, cooking ones, and any topic. There'd be ones about florists and people growing flowers, and they literally were doing everything. Now, of course, keep in mind for our audience who might be a little younger, keep in mind, the internet's not coming around for another like 15 years or so at this point. So at this point, your entertainment options are TV, movies, good old-fashioned reading, comic books, or video games. Those are basically your entertainment options at this point. Oh, and music, of course. And so one of the things you're going to see is that in Japan, youth culture was basically oriented around manga, but kind of almost all culture was. It was a convenient, disposable entertainment form, really. Yeah. And everyone appreciated it. Everyone liked it. Well, to one degree or another. I'm sure there's people that hated it, but...
they come later on.
Yeah, they come. Well, that's true. Well, not exactly. I mean, thanks to Go Nagai in the 70s, in the 80s, we do have the PTA movements.
True.
So we are going to see more and more censorship clamping down on manga and more of a homogenization of manga as well as they figure out what works. But again, we can talk about that as we go.
Yeah, that comes later because, again, everybody is still making money. Mm-hmm. And there was also another weird thing that kind of predominated Japanese culture up until fairly recently. Mm-hmm. It seemed to be this idea that they didn't freak out like we did over things because there seemed to be this attitude that if something's not real, it doesn't have the impact.
Right.
Like we would have people, I remember like we talked about in the 80s, they complain about, say, like Dungeons and Dragons would turn you into a satanic mass murderer. And that idea gained traction. It wasn't just like a couple of parents groups. Eventually it was everybody, and serious news would talk about it. And there'd be like discussions about this in papers, and there would be like book burnings and civil authorities passing laws about it and such. Mm-hmm. And up until, again, fairly recently in Japan, it looks like that thing never quite took off because there was this thing like, it's just fake. Just, chill the hell out. It's not real.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes to weird ways, because that was the idea of like Japanese censorship that compared to here. Because again, when you get into the 80s, you start getting into like some of the hentai stuff.
Yes, and well, 80s is the birth of basically Japanese like porn manga. Basically comes about during the 80s, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it actually comes about more or less during the 80s.
It does, and I would say that because you had adult stuff prior, but again, it would be more. It wasn't just like, say, sex and nudity for the sake of sex and nudity, or violence for the. Well, they do violence for the sake of violence. Thank you,
they do violence for the sake of violence. Remember, the 80s included comics like Rapeman, for example.
Yeah, but I'm talking like earlier.
Oh, okay.
And it kind of came about in the 70s because, like we said, the 70s comics became a form of rebellion. That was like the no good, like, kids would get into that, and it'd be like, you'd be downtown and they'd go, oh my god, that guy has like Young Sunday, he's a badass, I don't want to mess with him. Which seems,
said no one ever, I think, but okay. Sure.
Well, no, there was kind of, because again, remember Japan tends to be more homogenous than here.
True.
So it takes a little less to make yourself more of a rebel. That's
true.
But that was where this attitude came from, and that was where you got a lot of the stuff later on. And then, like I was saying, Japan has weird censorship rules that seem to, a lot of it floated around this idea that fake is okay. And the hentai stuff is a great example because in Japan, at no time could you ever show a penis.
Yes, that's true.
Ever. Even if you were doing hardcore porn, you could not show a penis.
Nope.
So what they started doing is say, okay, I can't show a dick, but how about a giant tentacle rape monster? And it was like, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead, knock yourself out.
Well, it goes back to Hokusai, right? We talked about that last time. He did the first tentacle porn.
He did, like hundreds of years prior, which is weird. Yep. But again, it's that idea that because it wasn't real, you were cut a little bit more slack. I mean, we sort of had the same thing here for a while with the imitatable acts.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
And that was the idea in a cartoon. You couldn't show anything that a kid could do and get hurt like doing.
Yes.
But yeah, in Japan it works really weird, and you kind of start seeing that, especially late 70s going into the 80s.
Yep. One thing before we go whole hog into the 80s, although I think we kind of already started, but something we forgot to mention last time we were talking about the 70s that I realized is kind of important is in 1975... I believe it's 75. Comiket opens.
Yep.
And Comiket is kind of important. Basically, what Comiket is, for those of you who don't know, it's basically a place for people to trade fanzines. Because naturally, while comics were a major art form, lots of people were drawing their own comics. Like there was lots of, not just small press, but what they call doujinshi, which is basically just like fan fiction. They're what we'd call fan fiction today, in just comic form. And there were tons of this stuff being done.
Yeah.
And in 1975, so when Comiket first opened, it was mostly by fans of the artist Moto Haggio, who we briefly mentioned last time. She's one of the group of 24 that are the original wave of female shoujo manga artists, female girls comics artists. Anyway. So originally in 1975, it was a small one-day marketplace for doujinshi, fanzine, and fan art producers. It had 32 sellers and about 600 attendees in 1975. By comparison, in 2012, it lasted 3 days, had 35,000 sellers, and over 500,000 attendees.
Yeah.
And Comiket is very, very important for many reasons, not the least of which is Comiket basically ended up becoming a factory in some ways for manga experimentation and manga artists to come out of that would eventually go mainstream. Like at this point, what was happening is we were starting to see people, they would do fan work and then eventually they would graduate to doing proper manga.
Yeah.
Also, they were trying different stuff. And so they were injecting, we'll call alternative styles and alternative approaches into the manga consciousness, so to speak, even if it was just on the fanzine small press level.
Yeah. And
I'm sure that some of that probably also started to leak up into the mainstream stuff eventually as well.
It does, and that was why the Comiket though is it's like I consider it kind of more of an 80s thing for what you're getting at.
Yes.
When
I can see that.
When it started, the closest you can think of it is if you remember in the early 70s here in North America, we had Star Trek conventions.
Yes.
And it was basically that the fans would come out, they'd bring their own stuff, they'd have like fan products, fan stories, they'd discuss like the old, like for the Trek ones, the old shows, they come up with like letter writing campaigns, things like that. It was kind of that idea. And then it when you get to the 80s, it takes off. And that was one of the big things. Like you said, it became a farm that a lot of the bigger companies would go to look for up and coming artists that they could then hire to do stuff for them. And that was one of the reasons why in the 80s, they didn't bring the hammer down on it.
Right. Yes, we should explain about that. So what you got is people producing like stories that with the characters of popular comics that of course are copyrighted stories. But unlike taking the the Disney approach or some other corporate approaches, they basically say, these, as you said, these kids are actually turning out stuff that's helpful and it's a good thing for young artists to do this stuff. So we're just going to let them go with it. I've always read, though, that also Japan's copyright laws have a little bit to do with that, the way they're written. It's perfectly possible for me to do, 100-issue Dragon Ball comic, and just because I've done that, I can't suddenly claim to Toriyama that my copyright is equal to yours or something like that.
Right.
Or that your copyright is in the public domain because you've let me do it or something like that.
Right.
I can produce work based on yours and sell it, and unless you decide to stop me, there's nothing involved. Like there's no harm done, and we're not going to worry about it. Whereas in American stuff, if I produced massive amounts of Star Trek fan fiction, in theory, I could harm the Star Trek copyright eventually.
Yeah.
It didn't work out that way for various obvious reasons, but that's one of the reasons why periodically Paramount has clamped down on Star Trek fan fiction and fan productions. At least part of the reason anyway, is because the way American copyright law is written, unless you defend your copyright, challenges can actually result in you losing it.
Yeah. The other thing too, though, because if you remember when you do start getting into the 90s, even in Japan, they did start shutting down some of the fan stuff. Because that was where something else that comes out of this period. that ties in a great deal to the comics, and that was you had the garage kit industry started up.
Right.
And that was people who would produce model kits of different characters, and they'd maybe, some of them would only be like, say, 20, 100 would be like a normal run. And it wasn't a big deal, and the companies let this kind of thing happen because they saw it as good publicity.
Mm.
But then when you start getting to the end of the decade, it's the same thing like Paramount with the Star Trek stuff. If Paramount currently isn't worrying about a Star Trek anything, they kind of turn a blind eye because they figure at the very least it's keeping their property in the public eye. But as soon as they decide to do a new series, all of a sudden out come the cease and desist orders.
Yep, which is exactly right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They were willing to let people do it and even make fan TV series while it was only the movies coming out. But as soon as they do their own series, they don't want that confusion, so cease and desist, left, right, and center.
And that's it. It works kind of the same in Japan. One of the things that you also saw happen mid 80s going into the late 80s with like the Comiketo and different things like that, the people who started out doing fan works would then produce their own works. And that worked out because, again, remember at this time, like we were just saying, there are hundreds of these weekly magazines coming out, and they're always looking for content.
Yep, they're always looking for talent, always looking for content, and we didn't really talk about this last time, actually, but we probably should take a moment to discuss this, especially since I suspect it may be the result of the 80s, and definitely as a result of the Shonen Jump way of doing things, okay? A manga artist in Japan works a little differently than a manga artist here in North America. They work a little differently than a comic artist here in North America. Because you need to produce content weekly as opposed to monthly, which is the North American standard, your average manga artist in Japan is basically kind of the head of an assembly line.
Right.
Where there will be a manga artist, maybe a writer as well. They may or may not be the same person. And then underneath them, there's a whole team of artists that are basically doing the grunt work to help get that manga out.
Right.
Generally speaking, this can range anywhere from 1 or 2 to, I suspect it is top Toriyama probably had like 5 or 6 or more. But I definitely know that they use a system where your average artist is a bunch of assistants, where the artist does something like the pencils, I believe, and then they let the assistants do most of the actual inking and different steps and the backgrounds and everything else. Like, it's almost like the artist themselves becomes almost more like a director, if you want to use the film term. And then they've got all these other artists who are doing different pieces that are providing all that basically go into the final assembly.
Yeah, it's not too different from how we do it here, though.
Okay.
Because, I think we've mentioned this before. What happens here, the way it used to work is a comic book would have a writer, probably a penciler, an inker, a letterer, a colorer. You might have what they would call a plotter. A plotter would be somebody that would do the basic story, kind of like the basic, what they nowadays, I guess the cool kids call it the basic beats of the story. You could have an embellisher, which was somebody who would add effects to the art, things like that. Japan kind of works the same. They divvy up a little different because what they'll do is a lot of times you'll have the main artist will do the actual figures, and then somebody else will do backgrounds.
Right.
And then somebody else will do effects. And sometimes you'll have a guy who does the inking. Sometimes they'll put the tone in. But sometimes it'll be like the background person will do the penciling, the inking, and the tone work for the whole background.
Yep.
Like, they divvied up a little weird compared to ours, but it's not entirely different. What tends to be different is the volume, because a Japanese cartoonist is expected to do 30 to 40 pages a week for one story.
Well, it's not entirely true. I mean, I've noticed that at least with a lot of modern stuff, they're usually only doing 16 to 20 pages.
They do, but some of it doubles up.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
That's true. Sometimes they do have the double issues, but they're doing an average of 2 or 3 pages a day, basically. That team has to be able to produce. And at least, anyway. And so that's a fair amount of work, especially if there's going to be some special splash pages and other effects and enhancements involved.
Yeah.
So yeah, because they're doing it a week, that's a huge number. So people burn out a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot of that pressure goes onto the assistants. So going back to our point about Comiket, so there's this huge need for competent assistants in the system.
Yeah.
And of course, the better assistants will often go on to become manga artists themselves, because of course every assistant, of course, has their own manga that they dream of eventually debuting once they get their chance.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't say everyone, but most of them do. Just like in Hollywood, I imagine, everybody's got a script that they want to sell. Kind of like that.
Yeah, kind of.
Except their odds are a little higher in the manga industry because, as is noted, there are so many comic books out there and so much content that's being produced. Getting your stuff, if you're half decent, getting it produced is not that difficult. Like getting it actually to air, so to speak, and in front of an audience is not really that tough.
It can. There's kind of been some twists in the last 20 years.
Well, okay, getting it to air, so to speak, in Shonen Jump, okay, if you're only aiming for the top, is more difficult. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But if you're going for one of the lower tier manga, I would imagine there's a lot more variability there. Again, depending on what you want to do.
Yeah, it's easier than here because again, the biggest thing that Japan has going for its comic industry is that it has a huge diverse audience.
Yes, it does.
And that means you can publish different kinds of stories, and what makes that important is because there's always a variety of stories, there's always something new to become the next big thing.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that killed our industry back in the 90s was that once Image made all the money, everybody did Image. And then when Image was no longer cool, there was nothing to replace it.
Yep. And that's the crash.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to some crashing pretty soon. We better get back on our historic track. Because there is a big manga crash coming, but we'll get to that in a bit. So 1980s happened, and at the beginning of the 80s, I mentioned some titles, but at the beginning of the 80s, there's really one title we've got to mention. That the one title to rule them all, so to speak, of course, is Dragon Ball, which starts, I believe, Dragon Ball starts in 83, if I remember right.
Yeah, the original's early 80s.
The original, yeah, I believe the original is 83. And, sorry, 84. December 84. Sorry. It's December 84. Dragon Ball started appearing in Weekly Shonen Jump by Akira Toriyama. And he'd already had a mega hit with Dr. Slump, which had been running since the late 70s. And he decided to do something a little more action adventure oriented with the original Dragon Ball. Not entirely to be confused with Dragon Ball Z, because Dragon Ball Z, of course, is like non-stop fighting, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the original Dragon Ball was a little more adventure oriented, shall we say? Yeah. And Dragon Ball itself, of course, is based loosely. The original one is basically loosely on the Legend of the Monkey King from China, one of the 4 great Chinese classics, which is a high-end fantasy novel, more or less, about the Monkey King's. What's his name? Wukong, the Monkey King Wukong, and who's called Son Goku in Japanese, I believe, or something close to that, which is where the Goku's name comes from in Dragon Ball. Yeah. And how he travels with a monk across this demon-infested landscape to help the monk reach paradise or something to that effect. I don't remember exactly what their goal is, but basically it's the Monkey King kicking lots of demon butt. That's the simple version of, which is pretty much how Dragon Ball works out, with the character of the monk basically being replaced by Bulma.
Yeah, kind of. That's kind of.
It's very loosely based on the Legend of the Monkey King. Yeah, he kind of goes his own way with a lot of things. So you can't say it's not an adaptation so much as he's just taking pieces of it that he likes.
Yeah, he did. And he did that with a lot because it's an adventure. Like at one point, Goku fights Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. and there's this like weird evil empire trying to take over. And as I recall, I think Dragon Ball is set in the world of Dr. Slump. I think it's the same setting.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I think it is. Because
Sorry, go.
Oh, no, I was going to say, because Dr. Slump was, like, crazy popular.
I believe it. No, I believe Dr. Slump was saying... The only thing is, doesn't Dr. Slump basically take place in a modern version of our world, kind of? Or is it just really vague about that whole thing?
It's kind of vague. It's another one. It's this weird cartoony world, and he kind of throws whatever he likes in, because, like, Superman shows up regularly in it.
Oh, okay.
And there are these weird little, like, alien guys, little alien Cupid guys that show up, and it's just... Dr. Slump, as I recall, too, it was supposed to be like a Doctor Who parody. That's why he kind of looks like a greasy Tom Baker.
Oh, really? I didn't know that, huh?
Yeah, and it was just Toriyama throwing in everything he liked into one big wacky kind of story.
Yep. Oh, it definitely was.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, yeah, it was influential. It was one of the things that kept the whole the more cartoony style going in Shonen Jump at that point.
Yeah.
When a lot of the other stuff was more Gekiga influenced and more serious.
Yeah, there was a weird mix because, like you were saying, because the early '80s is kind of when we around here we started getting our mitts on these things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was intermittent, but you get one, and I've got issues that have like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in it, which is this like kind of over the top tough guy story.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that I have was it was post Hokuto no Ken,
right?
But the guys that did Hokuto no Ken were doing, I think it was like called something like Cyber Blue,
okay,
which was Hokuto no Ken in a cyberpunk setting, basically.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of that one before.
And it was this weird, like, gritty thing. And you had the, what was the one it ran forever about the, like, the tough guy high school?
Oh,
I can't remember the name.
Crap.
No, it wasn't.
I don't remember.
No, it wasn't.
I know what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're talking about, but,
yeah. Sakigake Otokojuku.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like tough guy school, and it was about these delinquents. And then they had this one. It was this weird kind of South Parky sort of Tarzan parody was running at the time.
I've seen that one, yeah.
And the one with the little round-headed guy, who each story is a parody of a different kind of story.
Okay.
And it's just like wacky over there. And it's this bizarre just mix of stuff. All kind of, and they were doing that in the 80s. Cause again, it was that idea of, they were experimenting and they were always looking for the next big thing. Mm-hmm. Because they would mix things up in weird ways. You mentioned City Hunter.
Yeah.
And City Hunters, people ostensibly consider it like an action story. It's like Miami Vice kind of thing. But it's more of a soap opera, really.
Sort of.
It's like a wacky comedic action soap opera.
Kind of. I mean, it pretty much runs... No, it's pretty formulaic. I mean, each episode, it's City Hunter, for general reference, is about a private detective in Japan named Ryo Seiba, who's basically, he's... Like, he literally looks like he walked out of Miami Vice. He is, like, actually the most badass, competent... what's the best way to describe him? He is a super badass, competent, crack shot, incredibly capable detective guy who also happens to be the world's biggest, drunken lech. And heavy on the lech. He's a super pervert.
Which he's horrible at.
He's horrible at. Yeah, he's incredible at combat, but he's incredibly bad at almost everything else except he's okay with the detective stuff. And so each week, some damsel in distress will show up. He will lech on her. His assistant, whose name escapes me at the moment, will hit him with a giant hammer to get him to lay off damsel in distress of the story. And then they'll find out that her father, uncle, brother, sister, cousin was involved in some shady stuff, and the adventure will begin. And then from there it plays out like a fairly typical pulp adventure with some, weird humor left there. And at some point, our hero, who plays it goofy most of the time, when the time comes, will turn into an astonishing badass and basically beat the bad guys to death. Occasionally, literally. But usually he'll just impress them and scare them with his sharpshooting and such, to the point where they'll just give up. And then in the end, he'll latch on the girl. She'll push him away. His assistant will probably hit him with the hammer again, and that'll be the end of that story.
But they would do ones too that were depressing, because as I recall, didn't he not know who his family was or something? Something
like that. I've only I've watched some of the TV shows, and maybe about about 20 episodes of the original TV show. I got a DVD set of it a couple years ago, cheap, so I was watching some of them. I've read a few of the comics, so I don't know. Again, they seem like fairly goofball detective stories to me. I wouldn't say there was a big background, but maybe there was one running, kind of an overarching one running.
Yeah, because we got mostly the comics, and this is before any of us could read them. But I do remember they would do the comics would do comedy episodes.
Well, it is meant technically to be a comedy.
Yeah, well, because it's
comedy.
It's that hodgepodge, because that wacky action comedy thing, that was one of the things you started seeing a lot more of in the 80s.
Yes, yep, that's definitely true. Although Go Nagai was technically doing that in the 70s.
Yeah, he was, but Go Nagai's idea of a lighthearted comedy was a little... It was a lighthearted comedy in the Shakespearean tradition, in that only half the cast would die a horrible, violent death by the end of the series in the comedy.
Okay, you got me there.
And that was one of the things, I think, when you got to the 80s, you also started to see kind of more optimism in that.
Right. Well, it was a very optimistic period. Japan in the 80s was in some ways was a frickin' paradise. I mean, it was one of the high points of human capitalist culture in some ways. I mean, they were literally flush with money. I mean, everyone was happy. Everyone was successful. There were jobs everywhere. There was money everywhere. People were having a grand old time.
Yeah, and I think, too, that was kind of the reaction to the 70s, because the 70s were kind of a darker period.
Also, it's something to keep in mind, the 80s, just like in North America, the 80s is also the era of the children of the baby boomers.
Yeah.
That would be our counterparts in Japan. So we're looking, and Japan does have a baby boom. They did have one. And so we're looking at, here, the kids that are reading these comics that we're just talking about right now are basically the Gen Xers of Japan.
Yeah, they'd be around our age.
And they're being produced by baby boomer, basically. Some baby boomers, and some of what in North America would be called the greatest generation as well.
Yeah.
Kind of a mix there. Because Tezuka, of course, is not a baby boomer. He's from well before that period. And so are a lot of the older guys, like Ishinomori is. But I think Go Nagai might actually be a baby boomer.
Yeah, he'd be like our parents' age.
Yeah, he would be.
He'd be like the generation just before, because he started in the late 60s, and he would have been in his 20s.
Right. And so at this point in the 80s, it's a new generation that's coming in, that's reading the stuff, and they want stuff that's a little more lighthearted, that's a little less dark, because their parents have just lived through the dark, polluted times when Japan was basically a nation of factories all working themselves to death. And now it's the affluence that comes after that. And they're enjoying it, and it's reflected in their media of the time.
Yeah.
So to continue, since we keep jumping around, so Toriyama does Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
And it's a huge hit. And will, of course, be followed a little bit later, a couple years later, by Dragon Ball Z, which literally changes the entire boys comic industry in Japan.
It breaks everything.
It breaks everything. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
And also, but before we get to Dragon Ball Z, we should note that the other thing that you'll see popping up in the 1980s is you'll see more seinen stuff popping up. which is because what we're seeing is, as we referenced, that we now have basically porn comics coming out, but we're also seeing stuff that's targeted towards a more mature audience.
Yeah.
As I talked about before, seinen, of course, means like a period of change or changing years, basically, is what the Chinese characters would translate to. And it's basically meant for people that are in their 20s, like university age and up till maybe about 30 or so. And, of course, there's also comics, because they've been around long enough, for mature men as well. There's actual, I don't remember what they're called. There's a name for them, but the ones that are basically over 30.
Right.
And there are also ladies comics that literally they're called ladies comics, ladies komiksu, they call them, which are literally women's comics that are meant for like mature women as well that are coming out. As we said, there's comics for everyone on every subject at this point.
Yeah, because that's a good point. One of the things that comes out of the 80s is the Josei comics.
Yes, that's true.
Which is kind of what you're getting at. Josei is kind of the female version of the seinen stuff. Like seinen comics are
female seinen stuff, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and it tends to be like, we might call it soap opera-ish, but it tends to be a little more deep, a little more dramatic.
Right.
And that starts taking off during the 80s too.
Yes, definitely.
Like that was, for comics wise, that was probably the how we said earlier that every decade kind of has its big movement. Mm-hmm. I think for the 80s, that would have been the big movement for Japanese comics.
Yep. And this is why the Japanese characters of the 80s, oddly enough, I'd say, are some of the most realistic, like mainstream character-wise.
Yeah.
You're going to see a lot of artists come out of the 80s who draw in a more realistic, quote-unquote, style. Like, they're still manga characters, but they're not the style that Toriyama uses. They're not the style that a lot of people think of when they talk about manga, which is more of an anime style, which again is closer to Toriyama's style.
Yeah.
The stuff in the 80s is a little more like American stuff, where the characters look more realistic. I mean, there'll be some exaggerations, obviously.
Yeah.
But they actually do look more realistic than we're used to thinking about today in terms of manga styles. And if you want to see examples of that, go look at things like Mai the Psychic Girl, which came out in America as well. That was a classic one.
Yeah.
We've got Akira. What else? What are some of the other... as I said, Fist of the North Star is using that slightly more realistic style. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is... just a lot of stuff. That was actually a fairly popular style during the 80s.
Yeah,
it was stylistically in shonen, and then of course in seinen, that's pretty much the standard style.
Yeah, especially by the time. One of the things you got too that I think you're kind of hitting at was you got more emphasis on character in the 80s.
Yep.
And it was again that idea. I think because the more dramatic stuff was picking up, people wanted their characters to be more fleshed out.
Right.
Like even into the 70s and the 60s, the more serious stuff, the characters tended to be either agents of the plot, or they would drive the plot, and they would have just enough personality and depth to keep things moving. Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't get a lot of really character introspective stuff.
No, well, they're mostly action stories. At least the Shonen Jump stuff is.
Yeah, but even the more soap opera-y stuff from the earlier ages, it tended to be kind of more melodramatic.
I could see that.
And that was again, a lot of people say the Josei movement happened because you had the fans of that melodramatic soap opera-y stuff from like the 60s and the 70s. That they were a little older now, a little more mature, and they wanted something that likewise was a little more mature.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, you've got an aging comic reading population, so naturally the comics are going to grow with them.
Yep. And that was the thing that we never quite got the hang of here, because here the attitude was always comics was something you did for a few years, you moved on, the next group came in. And then when you got to the middle, late 80s, where the company started realizing there were long-term fans, nobody knew what to do with them here.
Right. which goes back to the whole point about the whole comic witch hunt that happens in the 1950s, really held back our comic industry in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's odd, actually. I would say that our comic industry, up until then, was actually running ahead of the Japanese one. I'd say we were actually more advanced than they were.
Yeah.
But after that, we fell horribly behind. And it took a long time for us to catch up. And in fact, you could possibly even argue that we still haven't quite caught up with them, and maybe never will because of the way things have worked out.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because what happened with us, when our comics died, the newspaper strips kind of kept going and kept appealing to different audiences. But then when you got to the 80s, those started to go in decline too.
Right.
But I could kind of maybe see that in another 5 or 10 years, we could have an uptick, because you've got the kids who grew up in the 2000s and that with the Japanese stuff, who got used to this idea of, oh, I can do a comic book that's just like a slice of life story. It doesn't have to have Batman in it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I can totally see that. And yeah, things are changing, but anyway, but I still think that we're behind mostly because of that damn commission. If they, if the seduction of the innocent thing hadn't happened, I think we would actually be well ahead of them. And actually, yeah, I could easily see, because for example, in Japan, they had their pulp period too, just like we did. By pulp, where there were the stories coming out with pulp fiction coming out every week in different magazines, etc. Except theirs transited into becoming manga based. Yeah. And mind you, they still had, and I think they still do actually have actual pulp fiction magazines in Japan. But theirs, translated to be more manga based, whereas because of the whole seduction of the innocent thing, Worth and Commission, ours didn't. When that time came to transition, ours was locked in, as comics as kids stuff, and it had to stay there for another decade or two until that kind of all wore off. And as an end result, theirs ended up being, exploding into all these different genres and taking all these different approaches, whereas ours just stayed superheroes for the longest time.
Well,
Archie's.
Yeah, but that kind of happened again, because we had our big renaissance at the beginning of the 80s.
Yes, we did. That's true.
But I think what happened there is you didn't really have the numbers to sustain it. Mm-hmm. And then when you had the black and white glut, that cut down on the quality of the material. Mm-hmm. And then you had the Marvel and DC move in the mid-'80s, and that kind of brought us right back to where we were before. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I can see that.
And that's where, we've been stuck ever since. That it's even today, when anybody talks about comic books in North America, they're talking superheroes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Even though that hasn't been the base of the North American comic industry for a while now.
No, it hasn't. But that's what people think of. I mean, that's the natural association. I mean, you can't really help that.
No, and again, it's really bizarre, because it's that idea that for our comics now, Archie, issue for issue, I think outsells a Marvel or a DC.
I think that's been the case for a very long time, actually.
Yeah, but it's not what comes to mind. People don't even think of it as a comic book.
No, it's just background noise for most people, I think.
And even when you see any kind of North American show or that talks about the comic industry, they never mention stuff like that. They never mention Archie at all.
No, I can see that. And that is unfortunate.
And I think again that comes from the 80s, when the black and white glut kind of killed comic shops, and Marvel and DC finally got their chance to swoop in.
Yep, I think so. All right, so let's continue on then. So the 80s is the seinen decade, lots of stuff, lots of variety. Mm-hmm. We kind of, we've been talking about this for 40 minutes, so I think our audience has the point at this point. All right.
Although there's two 80s things that I think you have to kind of think of.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because one of the things that starts in the 80s, and it's partly because of the Comiket, it's partly because of the garage industry, the doujinshi thing, is you start to see the comic books get tied in more with the merchandise and the animation.
That's true.
They start to become inseparable at this. Whereas as prior, there was a lot of overlap, but comics were still seen as their own thing.
Yeah, that's true.
And the other thing I think that you get that happens for a few weird things is by the middle of the 80s, you get this huge preponderant of like female lead characters.
That's true.
And it happens, I think, because number one, like we say, the Josei thing takes off. So people go, well, there's female readers. And what happens in like the early decade, they realize, I'm doing finger quotes here, if you make the hot chick the main character, you can show more of her.
That's true. And you mean that in every sense of the word.
It depends on what story it is. And then it leads to that weird thing where for a little while there's like no male action heroes in any like the Japanese comics and stuff.
I would disagree. I mean, okay, well, let's hit 1988.
Okay.
And in 1988, Dragon Ball Z comes out.
Yeah.
Okay, and as you accurately pointed out earlier, it breaks the comic industry. Dragon Ball Z comes out, and it literally becomes the most popular thing since, like, Tetsuwan Atom Astro Boy pretty much aired. I mean, it's hard to undersell Dragon Ball Z in the Japanese industry. Well, in general, in comics and that in general, it's hard to undersell Dragon Ball Z. In fact, I suspect pretty much everyone in our audience has probably heard of Dragon Ball Z. Many of them have probably seen it. It took a while to get over here, but once it did, it eventually was successful. Of surprise, it's successful everywhere it's aired.
Yeah.
It shifted from being the more adventure manga to becoming a fight manga. Is the best way to describe it. And it set the new standard. It literally set the new template for the whole shonen boys comic industry. Just by being so ungodly popular. You're laughing because you know I'm underselling it right now, just how popular Dragon Ball Z was.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of that came close to popularity and people out there are going to go, huh? But Rob's going to laugh. Was it Slam Dunk?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it was actually. It didn't make it over here, but it definitely was. Yeah.
Yeah, now
we can talk about that in the 90s.
Because that was the weird thing. Like Dragon Ball Z and Slam Dunk, like was everywhere for a few years.
Yep, absolutely. Slam Dunk, for those who don't know, but you can guess, is a basketball sports manga.
Yeah.
And during the 90s, it was super popular.
Yeah.
Right up there with Dragon Ball Z. And I think Slam Dunk was also, I'm pretty sure, was a Shonen Jump comic as well.
Yeah, it was. If it wasn't Shonen Jump proper, it was one of their affiliates.
Yeah, because Shonen Jump also, we didn't talk about this, Shonen Jump was so popular and was making so much money, they created, in the early 80s, apparently it was 1985-ish, they created, and this is not an exaggeration, they created Shonen Sunday, Monthly Shonen Jump, Weekly Shonen Magazine, and Shonen Champion.
Yeah.
And all of those come out around the same time.
Yeah.
Because in the late 80s, Shonen Jump just has so much of an audience and everything, they split off into 5 different phone books. Some of them are weekly, some of them are monthly, but for the most part, they're out there. I think Shonen Champion as well was more focused on the seinen one. I think that's where a lot of the seinen stuff comes from, is Shonen Champion, if I remember right.
Yeah, because when you got to the late 70s, they kind of tried starting this. But when you got to the 80s, a lot of the bigger companies started splitting up what they did. They do different kinds of books. So Shonen Jump would do like, okay, we want a comedy one, we want a serious one, we want a drama, and companies would do that. They'd be like, we want like a boys action, like a girls action, we want like a sports, and that's kind of important too, because you start seeing things grouped more specifically.
Yeah.
Like we were saying, when you get to the early 80s, it's hard to really peg down what some things were. Yes. Is it a comedy? Is it serious? Is it action? Is it soap opera? But when you start getting to the end of the 80s, because they're divvying things up like that, they start getting the hang of what makes what, and you can really start to see the formulas coming out.
Yep. And, well, it's the era, where they start figuring out, quote unquote, what works.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see more and more formulas. So each of these now 5 shonen titles that are coming out have a slightly different focus and probably have a slightly different house approach and house style at this point.
Yeah.
All of which are targeted towards whatever they think works. So Dragon Ball Z breaks the
everything.
Breaks everything. Yeah, it does. And so as an end result, everybody and their brother copies Dragon Ball Z. Surprise! Yeah. I mean, everyone loves it, so everyone thinks this is absolutely the way to go, and it creates what is known generally today as the shonen fight manga genre.
Yeah,
I mean, there are ones like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that were basically shonen fight manga, they were shonen action manga. But shonen fight manga is its own animal, and that basically is Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah,
like there's no other way to say it. It's Dragon Ball Z. For those who aren't familiar, the shonen fight manga formula runs really simple. You've seen Dragon Ball Z, you've seen it. We have a hero who usually spends most of his time powering up in one form or another. He's got to constantly become more and more powerful because more and more powerful enemies keep popping up, and he has to find out ways to defeat these new and powerful enemies. Except it's done over in a more serial format. You might be used to, a hero each week on an animated series learning things. Well, this is done over a long period of time. It's delineated. Sometimes he's referred to as tournament manga, and there's often tournaments in them where, they'll have a tournament arc, and it will run for years.
Yeah.
Where this endless supply of the hero and his buddies face off against this endless selection of villains. And our hero is constantly learning new power-ups and evolving, and that's the attraction of the whole thing, just watching the main character power up more and more and more and defeat villains.
Yeah, there's you can get it more specific. It happens because in the original Dragon Ball, there's this really long story where the 2 main characters enter this big martial arts tournament, and that part of Dragon Ball was crazy popular. So Dragon Ball Z is that. And what the formula is you've got your hero, and a bad guy or a group of bad guys shows up, and they're totally awesome and unstoppable.
Right.
They kick our hero's ass. Our hero finds out he's got to power up by learning the new secret whatever technique. And it usually involves finding the ancient master who knows this technique, and our hero struggles through it. The hero's sidekicks valiantly fight against this powerful foe, get their ass handed to them. The hero finds this teacher, after struggling, learns the secret that no, the power was in you all the time or whatever, gains the technique, shows up, kills the bad guy. Everybody's happy until the next even more awesome or bad guy shows up.
Yep.
Hero gets his ass kicked, finds out, to beat him you have to learn this secret technique with this mask, goes and wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's
some version of that, yeah.
That's the formula, and you find out after Dragon Ball Z, everything becomes that.
Yep. Because it worked so well.
Yeah.
That the entire industry, at least the entire boys comic industry, I'm sure part of the girls too, basically just follow that formula.
Well, it does, because what ends up happening in the early 90s is you get the girl version of that.
You mean Sailor Moon?
That's right. Sailor Moon is Dragon Ball for girls.
Yeah. Yep. And they were originally, I think, they even... Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, I think, actually aired back to back or something back in when they were actually first on TV, the cartoon version, anyway. I mean, I'm pretty sure they aired back to back. I'm not. Whatever. Anyway, but the key point is I know they were marketed together.
Yeah.
You could literally see everything. Here's the Sailor Moon stuff, and here's the Dragon Ball Z stuff, and it was literally marketed together in commercials and everything.
Yep, and it's because essentially it's the same form. Sailor Moon is considered it's like a magical girl story.
Right.
And you had those before.
Yep.
But it didn't have that idea that, okay, now when these bad guys show up, I have to learn the new super ultimate whatever technique because it's the only way to beat them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that came from Dragon Ball. Sailor Moon adds that. And then you get just, like, the 90s is just copies of those. Like, everything that comes out is either Dragon Ball Z or Sailor Moon.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to describe it.
Kind of an exaggeration, but kind of not.
Yeah. And to give you another perspective on this, where is it? There it is. So looking at, I've got a sales chart here for Shonen Jump. Okay, so in, let's see, 1988, when Dragon Ball Z premieres, Shonen Jump, this is in millions per week, of course, is at about 4.6 million copies per week. Okay? It gets up to about, we'll say about, by 1995, it gets up to 6.2 million copies. Mm-hmm. Like, it goes up by about almost 2 million copies a week. Thanks literally to Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah.
And I can pretty much prove this. And you know how I can prove this? And this is where things get really amusing in a way. Actually, wait. No, sorry. I was looking at the wrong chart. Okay, let me re-say that. Okay, so I can prove this because in 1989, when Dragon Ball Z premiered, it was selling just under 5 million copies a week. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then by 1995, when Dragon Ball Z finishes, it was up to just under 7 million copies a week. Mm-hmm. So it had gone up almost 2 million copies a week. And if you look at the chart that I'm looking at, of a weekly Shonen Jump, I'll link to it in the show notes. You can literally see the point where Dragon Ball Z starts. It was already already going up, but there's this huge jump. Okay, and here's the other way I can prove this is so in 1995, Dragon Ball Z finishes. Okay, and Shonen Jump is just under 7 million copies a week. Okay, within about a year, they're back down to 4 million copies. Mm. Literally 3 million of their weekly readers were just there for Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as Dragon Ball Z finishes, their sales just it's literally a cliff. They just drop right off.
Yeah.
And it's scary.
It is, because there's a couple other things that I think sort of come into play at that point. Mm-hmm. What ends up happening with anything is you're always... Yeah, like we were saying, how things worked here, you'd be a comic fan for like 3 to 5 years, then you'd move on, new guys would come in.
Right, yeah.
I think what you start seeing in Japan during that time is kind of what happened here in the 90s, that because Dragon Ball Z made all the money, everybody did Dragon Ball Z. When Dragon Ball Z was done, the interest kind of started to wane.
Yep.
And there really wasn't another next big thing to step in and take that place.
No, there wasn't. And in fact, actually, looking at the weekly Shonen Jump chart, which I'm still looking at here, it's interesting. In 1997, suddenly it levels out. The drop suddenly levels out at 4 million hits in 1997, and then stays there for a little bit, and then continues kind of to slowly wind down and goes up and down. Mm-hmm. But do you know what came out in 1997 in Shonen Jump?
What?
One Piece.
Okay, yeah, that works.
One Piece starts in 1997. I don't think Naruto did. What year does Naruto start? Crap. Let me just check.
I think Naruto was later. I think that was like...
I think it is too. But
I think that was like...
double check.
I want to say
97.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, 97. So both Naruto and One Piece started in 97. And so there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. So both Naruto and One Piece started in 1997. Mm-hmm. Surprise. And so... this is why it levels out.
Yeah.
Because the two new contenders, basically, the replacements for Dragon Ball Z, both start at that time.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, both of them, especially when they start, and you could say for quite a bit afterwards, are both using the Dragon Ball Z formula.
Yeah, kind of. I think...
No, they are, at least to begin with.
Well, I think One Piece does. Naruto was a little different, and we've mentioned this before.
Okay, I see your point, yeah.
Because when Naruto starts, it's a totally different comic from what it becomes like a short time after. Because like we said, when Naruto starts, it's basically modern times, but the feudal era never ended.
Yeah, pretty much.
And he comes from, like, was it the village hidden in leaves or whatever?
Yep, the village hidden in the mist or leaves or whatever, yeah.
And they're this ninja clan, and you very clearly see that the samurai are the government, and there's this society, and there's a world, and the ninjas take like different kind of jobs. They're considered like the disposable extras, and Naruto and his buds are in class, and they're apprentice ninja, and they take these kind of like, the first one I remember was they were guarding a bridge. Mm-hmm. And it was them guarding a bridge. And it wasn't quite Dragon Ball. That sort of happens around the time they introduce Rock Lee and the other guys.
Yes. Well, which is their first tournament.
Yep. And then after that, it's Dragon Ball, because then every story is, and then this guy shows up and we have to kick, and then they run into like Gaara, who's like another one of these kids possessed by these ancient spirits, and they kick his ass, and eventually he becomes like their associate, and if not their true friend, and then these other even more massive guys that for some reason nobody thought to mention earlier on show up, and then it swiftly becomes Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah, it's supposed to be... Okay, yep, I agree with you 100%. The irony is that One Piece has a slightly alternate perspective, where when One Piece first starts, it's an adventure, but it very quickly turns into Dragon Ball Z, and then it turns back into an adventure book, which is still kind of a hybrid. I mean, it's still a child of Dragon Ball Z, but it's changes a little bit. In fact, actually, I got out of One Piece for a little while because it was just too Dragon Ball Z, especially... for a little while there, in its early days.
Yeah.
And then it eventually developed its own voice, its own style, and then after that, it's one of the greatest comics in the history of mankind. But they're both children of Dragon Ball Z one way or the other, which is the point.
Yeah.
And it's not just them. You have to understand that if you read any comics from this period, there's a lot of Dragon Ball Z clones, like a lot of them.
Well, and they become, because... One Piece did the smart thing that it's Dragon Ball Z to begin with, but because they have the different like C's that are separated from each other, it doesn't have the problem that all the other ones do, where, like I just said, okay, we've beat this ultimate guy, and then this other guy shows up and he's like, oh no, it's the legendary blah blah, and you're like, that would have been great to mention a little while ago. Like, how is it that we're only now talking about this? Whereas in One Piece, whenever they go to a new land, everything's powered up. There's this new group of super awesome or bad guys, but you didn't hear anything about them because there's no connection between these two settings.
Yep.
That nobody, the hazards to get from one of the C's to the other is so great, nobody ever does it.
Well, at the one point, yes. After that, it sort of changes a bit, but yeah, you're right. As they're getting deeper and deeper along the Grand Line, it just everything just naturally powers up because they're going to more and more dangerous territory.
Yeah,
and I will say that Oda, who writes it, because I read it each week, and that he just, for example, had a payoff. Okay, that he set up 100 stories ago, and it's just this little thing was referenced 100 stories ago, not a major thing, just this tiny little reference 100, and then now it just turned into a huge payoff that like saved our entire heroes' lives and everything, and it keeps them up, and it's like that's the kind of thing that One Piece becomes after a while. It's just he is planning so far ahead. It's astounding, actually, some of the stuff he does, and that's why I like it so much. But anyway. So, yeah, and the Dragon Ball formula gets applied... No, it gets applied to sports manga.
Yeah.
It gets applied to golf manga, gambling manga, gangster manga. I have even seen it applied, and this is not an exaggeration, to a manga about heart surgeons. Mm-hmm. There's one called Iryu.
Oh, okay.
And it's a manga about... heart surgeons, except it plays out like a Dragon Ball Z story, where the guy is actually having to compete against higher and higher skilled other heart surgeons. But effectively, it still plays out like Dragon Ball Z. He's got the sidekicks and it's just, and they make it work. That's the most astounding part of it all. It actually works, and it's actually they did a couple live action series based on it. And it's like really intense to watch and everything, but it's basically still using the shonen fight formula.
Yeah, sometimes it works because I know for even today, I live in fear of that when I'm like reading a Japanese comic. Because there are so many that I used to like. A good example for me was a Yu Yu Hakusho.
Right.
The first couple of like volumes of the comic were neat. They were fantastic. It was about this like this guy. He's a total juvenile delinquent. Mm-hmm. And anybody who's never read it, the way it starts is he's this total juvenile delinquent. He's a loser. He's obnoxious. He's one step removed from being a thug. And he gets killed doing something nice. Mm-hmm. He tries to save this like little kid from getting hit by a car and he dies. And he ends up in the afterlife. And it's really funny because they stress that, no, the kid wasn't going to get hurt anyway. The kid was just going to get some minor injuries. So even this was pointless of you. But because he did something self-sacrifice like that, they couldn't send him to hell.
Right.
But he wasn't supposed to die yet, so they couldn't send him anywhere. And he gets sent back to Earth, and he's sort of like a wandering hero who's going to deal with like supernatural problems and stuff. Mm-hmm. And the first few volumes, like they send him back to Earth as kind of a test. He's not dead. He's not alive. And the stories are fantastic because they're these like weird, again, like very dramatic soap opera-y kind of things about him helping people on Earth. Mm-hmm. And then they let him come back. He gets some like powers, and it's interesting because then he's like hunting monsters and stuff, and it's interesting. And then they get to this one part where they have to stop this demon prince, and the ancient master that he had tracked down is like, you must learn this technique and enter his tournament. And I'm like, fuck! No tournament, because that's how it ends. That's how like any Japanese comic book like ends.
Well, they talk about that in Bakuman.
Yeah.
Which is a manga. I don't think we've mentioned this episode anyway.
No, because that's not till it's not till like the teens.
Okay, yeah.
We're getting there.
We'll get there eventually. Okay, well, I'll save it for later. We'll save that for later then. But yeah, they talk about that. Shortly after Bleach will come in 2001, so actually that's early 2000s one. But again, it's still using the Dragon Ball formula. And the Dragon Ball... Now, this is not to state, again, remember, that becomes the dominant formula, but in Japan, because their market is, again, so huge, there's still every kind of comic and every kind of story under the sun coming out. Yeah. It's just that this formula comes to dominate one form or another. Shonen Jump, which is the best-selling and top-read stuff.
Yeah, I think what you're getting to is in the 90s, the comic book industry starts to contract. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to get less variety because there's less companies. And I think what's happening is like we were saying for the 80s, when you get to the 90s, a lot of the focus, the comic books have kind of become the test bed for the cartoons.
Yes. Yeah, they have.
That they're now intrinsically tied. And that was one of the reasons why people wanted to get their stuff into the bigger publishers, because you were more likely to get a show that would get you marketing, that would get you more money.
Yep. Also, I would note, you also, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the character designs from the 90s also start being much simpler than the ones from the 80s. And I'd say no small part of that is because they're trying to make animation-friendly designs.
Yeah, I would... Yeah, because you get these weird... I used to call it CD-ROM style. Because anybody who remembers the original CD-ROM video games, you had these... Because of the way the graphics worked, like things in the CD-ROM games tended to be like big blocks of color. Mm-hmm. And you got these weird... like the comic... The dominant comic style was like bigger open areas with less line work. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's like you say, it was because they were looking more towards animation.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so because of that, you see a lot of the detail disappear from Shonen Comic.
Yeah.
From the characters, I mean.
Yeah.
Also, I noticed that part of that, though, might be practical. Because as they discovered people were willing to accept the less detailed version, so to speak, you got to remember, the less lines means it's faster to produce as well.
Yeah.
I think there is a production element happening here as well. So so you could argue that manga have been forced to a simpler style just from practicality over time. For one reason or another, that more detailed style was popular in the 80s, and then it kind of slowly disappears in the 90s for, again, a style that's more animation-friendly, but also just plain more production-friendly in general.
Yeah, I think there's also kind of a stylistic thing, because again, I think when you get to the 90s, it's the same thing. There's a rebellion against the previous thing.
Right.
One of the things I think you also get in the 90s was the Josei style comics. They tended to be like more simple art, more simple like line work, bigger open areas, that kind. And I think again, that works its way in. When Sailor Moon hits, the industry thinks, wait, girls like violence too? And that draws from that style as well, that it's that more, although the Sailor Moon comic had a lot of heavy line work, but it was again more of that open design.
It's very open.
Yeah.
It's almost more dreamlike.
Yeah.
In its presentation. But girls' comics of that period, now we're to the, was it Nakayoshi is, I think I think Nakayoshi is the female version of Shonen Jump. I might be wrong, but I think it's the number one girls' comic one. I can check that. But anyway, so most of the stuff that's in there has that kind of style.
Yeah.
Where it's much more dreamlike, it's much more soft. The lines on the panels are very light and even have little gaps in them and such. I mean, it's kind of like a flowing, emotional, dreamlike experience to read these stories more than it is like this solid, dramatic story often.
Yeah, and I think, and you start seeing again that kind of overlap.
Yep.
Because I think what's happening, you had that in when the girls' comics took off in the 80s, you had a lot of the guys' comics pick up some of it because it was new and different.
Yep.
And I think, again, in the 90s, you're starting to kind of see that swapping because of that. And I think, again, because the comic industry is contracting, you're getting more people working together, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, they've divvied up the audiences. They've kind of, because of the different kinds of comics they did in the 80s, they now have set formulas. They're kind of grouping it together, but you can't really necessarily do, like, just a specific golf comic and a tennis comic. There isn't big enough audience, but we can put them all together into like a sports comic.
Right.
And you'll get like the guy stuff and the girl stuff, and it kind of commingles a little bit more.
That's true.
I think you're kind of seeing some of that kind of thing happening.
Okay.
And then
I can see that.
And then it goes to the animation, because that's the goal. Like you were saying, everybody's moving towards animation-friendly designs, but that's starting to make everybody's comics look more alike because they're adopting the same kind of mindset when they're doing their design work.
That makes sense.
You saw some of that in the 80s too, because in the 80s you had one of the things that pops up is you had animation magazines.
Right.
You had like role-playing game magazines. You had video game magazines, and they'd all run comics.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of their comics would draw from whatever it was that they were the main magazine was relating to. And I think from, like, say, the video game and even the role-playing game ones, it looked a lot like the video game magazine comics. You did, again, start to see kind of that simplified design.
Right.
And that design working more towards another end, because it was like, it's video game-based stuff. 80s video game stuff was designed still fairly simple. When you got to the 90s, the CD-ROM kind of stuff, you had more of that kind of style working into those comics. When those magazines and that would die off and those cartoonists would move to wherever it was they'd get their stuff published later on, the bigger ones, they'd bring some of their technique that would commingle with what was in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's always cross-pollination going on. There's always stuff going back and forth and left and right and up and down. And
yeah.
Because, again, a lot of it, again, remember, comes with... There's that constant churn of artists as well, and art assistants especially.
Yeah.
That are going through. And some of those assistants will be working in multiple industries or multiple styles, or they'll be all over the place.
And there's also the thing, like, we've mentioned this a few times, but to keep in mind, what we're talking about are we're kind of trying to focus on the bigger trends, that there's still other things going on under the surface.
Lots of them.
And yeah, that tends to bubble up. Like, the Japanese comic industry is still huge at this time, even though we're using words like contraction and magazines like going under and that. It's still like mind-bogglingly huge.
Well, in the 90s, remember, Japan hit its monetary shocks.
Yeah.
That's the point where they hit their first taste of recession, basically, which is still going on today. And so as an end result, the glory days were over, basically. And so companies started to go out of business. I mean, not everyone didn't have the money they had before. For a while there was even a huge downturn in animation, but we'll get to that when we do an animation episode. But so, yeah, I mean, things were changing in the 90s. There's no question on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so anything else about the 90s we want to talk about?
I think that's kind of it. I think the biggest thing to take away about the 90s is that, again, the formulas were solidified. I think part of that, too, is like you're saying, because the economy's starting to slow down and collapse. The companies are looking to focus on what makes money. And the other big thing is that at this time you start seeing the comic books aren't just comic books. They're tied into like a bigger multimedia experience.
Well, yeah, they're basically doing what Marvel maybe is trying to do or should be doing right now, which is basically they should be using the comic books as a platform to come up with new properties that they can then use, spin off into animation and movies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But from what I hear, they're not doing all that great a job of, but whatever. But that's what's going on, and especially it started in the 80s, it's definitely continuing on the 90s and will continue to modern day, basically.
Yeah.
Where it's basically a test bed, especially the Shonen Jump stuff.
Yeah.
If you can get popular in Shonen Jump, you're almost guaranteed to get an animated series at some point. How long it'll last? That's up in the air, but you'll probably get one if you can get popular enough in Shonen Jump.
Yeah.
And some of those series can run for a long time. For example, the One Piece animated series is running since, I believe, 98, 97 or 98. I think 98, because it would have debuted a year after.
Yeah.
And One Piece has been running nonstop since 98. 1998. Think about that for a moment. Yeah, it's hitting its 20th anniversary. And it's not done yet. And according to creator, it's going to be going for a while yet. And this TV show is still one of the most popular cartoons, even though literally there are people alive now who weren't alive when it was started and are now going to university. Think about that for a moment. Anyway, so to continue on, so that's the 90s. In the 2000s, it's kind of more of the same. I mean, the 2000s we get Bleach, which you mentioned already. Bleach comes in 2001, and it basically becomes the third of, we'll call it the Holy Trinity of boys manga for about the next decade or so.
Yeah. They call them, what is it, the big millennial comics,
something like that. Yeah, I've just heard them referred to as the big three or the big millennial, but we're talking, of course, about One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach. Yeah, and up until literally like a year or so ago, those three were literally dominating the industry. I mean, the industry was those three comics in terms of sales. Like they were so much of the industry that everything else was just a pale imitation compared to those three titles. Only one of which is currently running, but we'll get to that.
That's coming up.
That's okay. Anyway, so what else happens during the 1990s? What else happens during the aughts? As I said, it's mostly more of the same. I mean, in terms of there is one other title, however, we should definitely mention for the aughts, which is Death Note, which comes out in 2003. Yep. Death Note was hardly the very first, we'll call it psychological manga, but it definitely set a new standard. Yeah. Death Note, for those of you who aren't aware, which means you're probably living under a rock, but here it is anyway, is about a kid named Light Yagami, a teenager, who finds a notebook, and he discovers that it's the notebook of a death god. And so if he writes someone's name and or how they died in that notebook, they will die, and they will die in that way. And he decides that he's going to use this notebook to purify the world and basically get rid of all the evil from the world and kind of make himself a new god, more or less. Yeah. He doesn't quite start out that way, but eventually he kind of loses it to the whole power. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, if you're paying attention, is it more or less is still following the Dragon Ball Z formula.
Mm-hmm.
It is still ultimately a shonen fight comic. It's a big variant of the Dragon Ball Z shonen fight comic, but it ultimately is. Because as Light goes through, even though he's not a good guy, so to speak, depending on your perspective.
Well, he starts that way. It just kind of goes downhill quickly.
It kind of goes downhill, and he fights a never-ending series of opponents who are, L and the other detectives who are trying to stop him. It's kind of, you know what it is? It's kind of the Breaking Bad of manga.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Where it literally, the hero gets this power of a god, and then he uses it to go on a crusade to fix the world, except that he's not going uphill and becoming a great hero. He's basically becoming, a devil, so to speak. Mm. And so the opponents that he's facing, instead of being evil, they're actually good guys.
Kinda. Some are.
Mostly good guys. Some are, some aren't. But anyway, there's some. You're right. Some are, some aren't. But the key point again is that it's kind of the Breaking Bad of manga. It's the Breaking Bad of the Dragon Ball Z formula, and it sets a new standard in its own way too by being purely almost psychologically based rather than characters physically hurting each other. Well, except for the horrible deaths.
Yeah.
Well, again, they don't physically hurt each other usually.
No, they do. It's just not directly.
Yeah. And so there's that whole dueling aspect that comes out of it, and that's a big thing. Oh, actually, we did miss something, but okay, we'll get back to that in a second.
We missed two, but when you mention Death Note, mm-hmm. I don't think I'd say it's not exactly the Dragon Ball Z formula. It's the version you had before.
Okay. Because
it's not that, and then a new all-powerful guy shows up that he must learn a new technique. Everything for the comic is kind of there right at the beginning. And what he's doing is he's kind of learning new ways of using what's already there. Mm-hmm. It's the Dragon Ball formula is literally the new threat comes right out of nowhere.
Right.
And it's literally, we have to learn this specific technique, get this specific power, whatever. Like that's kind of like it literally boils down to that.
Right.
Like I say, they add a few elements as Death Note goes on, but essentially it's all right there. Mm-hmm. And the stuff that gets added is stuff that kind of comes naturally from what's already there at the beginning.
It's a natural outgrowth of what's there at the beginning. I would generally agree with that. I would generally agree. I don't want to spoil it for the few who haven't actually read it, but yeah, okay, I would generally agree with that.
Because that was the formula, the Dragon Ball Z-esque formula before Dragon Ball Z, because it was always the one I would use as the best example of pre-Dragon Ball Z would be JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Okay.
Especially the third run when everybody had the stands, the weird little psychic buddy that was the manifestation of your power.
Yes.
Because the characters didn't develop new powers as the series went on. What was interesting is they'd come up with new ways to use the powers they already had. Mm-hmm. That nobody in JoJo's was powering up. They kind of do that in the first two parts. Mm-hmm. But it's not this. We must learn a specific technique. Is that the first two series are based on Hammon, which is this ultimate vampire fighting martial art.
Yep. And
they're learning that, but they're a student of that from like right at the beginning of the book. But yeah, in the third one, nobody gets a new power. As a matter of fact, the key to it is figuring out how the bad guy's powers work.
Yes.
And when you find out and you go back and you read them again, you're like, oh, that's what that was. Because again, it's not, it's the old version of that Dragon Ball formula where you have to come up with a new trick, but you're not specifically developing something new.
Right.
Like that weird power shift is what makes Dragon Ball Z Dragon Ball Z.
Okay. I could see that. And yeah, I guess you're right. In that sense, it's not. It is. You're right. It is following more of the JoJo's formula. Okay,
Yeah.
I can see that. I concede.
Because those guys did do Dragon Ball Z before they did Death Note.
Which one?
Hikaru no Go.
I was thinking that, but is Hikaru no Go Dragon Ball Z?
It's a much better written Dragon Ball Z because they get more into the characters' mindset, and the characters are characters. They're not just.
I guess I've read Hikaru no Go.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see your point. Yeah.
Yeah, because
I can see your point. It is really because the constant new opponents with the new funky moves and everything. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It is.
And it's Hikaru has Sai, the ghost who possesses the I think it's his grandfather's Go board.
Yes.
And Sai is teaching him how to play and teaching him how to think, like through the games and stuff, and it's kind of that Dragon Ball formula, but again, they set it up from the beginning, and everything kind of comes out of what they set up.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, again, it's that Dragon Ball Z, I have to improve, I have to power up, I have to learn this new whatever kind of thing.
Right. Okay.
Because
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, you're right.
And that comes out, and that one again, that was another one in like the aughts that was just crazy popular.
Yes, it was.
As I recall, they credit that comic with bringing back the popularity of Go in Japan.
Yes, they do. Yeah. Prior to that, Go was on the decline, and then there was a huge resurgence. Not just Japan, Asia in general, but definitely Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the thing, right? Any of these manga that come out and get popular end up in Taiwan, South Korea, China, Hong Kong.
Yeah.
They end up all over Asia, basically.
Yeah.
And they're usually just as popular in the other Asian countries as they are in Japan.
Yeah.
So, yes, it makes a huge deal. Okay, so what was the other thing? You said there were two things that I'd forgotten about the aughts. What were they?
Well, getting into the late 90s, going into the aughts.
Yes.
The other thing that affects comics, and this comes from, I don't want to just say animation, but it comes from, like we were saying, that the comics became tied into the multimedia package.
Yes.
The other big influence is, of course, I'm talking about Wallman.
That's not what I thought you were going to say.
No, that's not what I was. What did you think I was going to say?
I was pretty sure you were going to say Pokemon.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, of course, kids collecting shit.
And making it fight.
And making it fight. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And variants of that will pop up. Pokemon itself, if I remember right, is, mid-90s. And, but it takes a little while before it, takes off and completely dominates the industry. At least the younger side of it. I mean, ultimately Naruto and One Piece and that are aimed for kind of the, like, we'll call them the 8 to 14 set.
Mm-hmm.
But the Pokemon stuff tends to be more like the 6 to 12 set. Like it's got a slightly younger take. It's towards a slightly younger audience. It might even be 4 to 12, really.
It does, and that's an important part of it, because there is one for slightly older people.
Mm-hmm.
And that was...
Pokemon for slightly older people would be, what, Persona?
No.
Persona games?
No.
Which one?
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Oh. I guess that is for slightly older people.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Sure, I'll buy that.
And Yu-Gi-Oh! Is another one of those examples. If you read the comic, the first part of the comic has almost nothing to do with the cards.
Well, no, it was just a weird...
It was a possessed kid that if you pissed him off, he could challenge you to a game to the death.
Yeah, and he was playing things like Parcheesi to the death and things like that.
And
it was all these random games like rolling dice or whatever.
The dice one is one of my all-time favorites. Like, that was a brilliant ending. And it was, again, it was like a full-fledged comic. And then what ends up happening is Magic the Gathering takes off. Pokemon starts as like a card game in Japan, and it takes off.
Yep.
And then they say, make this about that card game, because there's a Magic the Gathering story in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's what Duel Monsters is.
Yeah.
It's literally Magic the Gathering. They don't call it that. They just call it that card game from America.
Yeah.
And then it becomes that, and at that point, it becomes Dragon Ball.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's true.
Except
it's collecting things Dragon Ball. I agree.
Yeah, and that's what Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And that whole kids collect it, make it fight. Mm-hmm. It's the Dragon Ball Z formula, except I don't find a trainer and power up. I buy something. Mm. And that was where they discovered you can sell things to kids, and then that becomes the whole for a long time, the animation industry, the comic industry, the tie-ins, it all becomes about kids collecting things and making it fight.
Yep. Well, it still is. I mean, they love that stuff. The kids love it, and the producers love it because it makes a ton of money.
Yeah.
And pretty much everything for a while there, everything that was coming out in Shonen Jump, especially during the mid-aughts, had a card game that went with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of Shonen Jump issues would often have cards in the magazine.
Yeah.
And so you had to collect it each week to get the new cards.
Yeah.
That was part of the selling point. If you want your new One Piece battle game cards or Naruto battle cards, you had to slowly assemble the deck by what you were getting in your weekly magazines. Mm-hmm. Like there'd be a couple cards each issue.
Yeah.
And then they'd have booster packs and all this other stuff. And so, yeah, they were all doing that in one form or another.
Yeah, because that was the thing. And that's, I think, at that point in the aughts is when the merchandising and that surpasses the comics. Mm-hmm. And you'll notice, like, when you look at the sales figures, you can see that, like, after 2000, everything kind of levels off. Mm-hmm. But it's at like half or less where the sales were going into, like, say, the mid 1990s for everybody.
Yeah. For everybody, yeah.
And I think it's because what's happened at that point too is you don't have as many of the small publishers. Anyone that was making money got amalgamated into one of the bigger publishers.
Probably, yeah.
Like for a lot of them. So you don't have the experimentation. The audience is kind of starting to contract. Mm-hmm. I think in part because, yeah, like for comics, the animation is superseding things. You're looking at the idea of doing live action movies of things.
Yep.
It's kind of like superheroes here. Nobody gives a shit about the Spider-Man comic because I can just watch a 2-hour movie and I don't have to worry about who the hell is this guy and what's all this and that's not Spider-Man. I don't understand it. The hell with it. Mm-hmm. And I think you start kind of seeing that in Japan. Now, mind, their numbers are still huge.
Yes.
Like today, a shitty selling comic book in Japan is still putting out like 300,000 copies a week.
Yeah.
Whereas a good selling comic in North America, if you're doing 100,000 copies a month, you're one of our top sellers.
Yeah. Compare that 100,000 versus like 300,000, and that's a crappy one.
Yeah. Oh hell, because Shonen Jump is still the biggest, and they're still at like 2 million copies a week.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's still 2 million copies a week, and that's with a competition from the internet.
Yep.
And like piracy, because let's be honest, these days, and this has been true for about a decade now, as soon as the Shonen Jump comic comes out, people are grabbing it, scanning it, and posting it online as fast as they possibly can. Well, I mean, that's the honest truth. They are.
They're doing that, but what's also kind of countering that is a lot of the Japanese publishers have really embraced the digital online publishing.
That's true.
Like more than they do here.
Well, they're trying to anyway.
Yeah.
But Japan being Japan, it's a slow process.
It is, but like I say, they're doing much better than they are here. Like Marvel and DC and that kind of hum and haw at doing their online thing, but I don't think they've really gotten the hang of it yet.
Right.
Like the actual print copies of their books are still where they make their money.
Right. Which is a scary thought. Although, Marvel and DC, they both have their subscription services.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much money they're making from them. I mean, that's not something they're releasing, so it's hard to say. I will say the print books must be making most of their money. Mm-hmm. But Marvel and DC have that interesting thing where they're both owned by mega corporations that have an interest in keeping them going for one reason or another.
Yeah.
I've heard, for example, that Marvel is mostly kept going and DC to a degree too, because they have to keep a lot of these characters in print, or they'll lose the copyrights on them. So this is why a huge number of old characters from like 20, 30 years ago will suddenly pop back up in stories. It's not because they're trying to reach back to their past and be true to their roots or something like that. No, it's because they need to keep that character in copyright. And so they keep bringing them back again. And that's what I've heard Marvel is doing a huge amount of. And again, they partly exist as a factory to produce new content and also preserve the copyrights on the old.
Yeah, the way it kind of works, at least it did, was Marvel and DC Comics were kind of like holding companies for the copyrights.
Right.
I don't know if it's that they have to publish specific characters, but they do have to show that they're still doing something with the characters.
Right.
There's a weird clause that if they don't, it falls into that like fair usage thing. Like like you were saying earlier about how if you don't challenge somebody using your stuff, it's tantamount to saying, "Nah, I'm not doing nothing with it. You do it."
Right. Yeah.
But for the longest time, like DC has been part of a mega conglomerate for a long time.
Oh yeah, they have been since like the 90s at least, if not the 80s.
Yeah, I think since the 80s. And then, but the thing is, the parent company doesn't really care about the comics.
No, Warner Brothers doesn't really care.
Yeah, it's just that's the placeholder. That's where all their copyrights are kept.
Yep.
And then Marvel used to be like that, and they still kind of seem to be, but they've been bought by Disney. And I could even see Warner with DC just all of a sudden saying, "No, we're coming in. We're totally restructuring this. This is the dead spot on our like yearly report. So we're going to do this now."
Well, as I know, they're basically just exist under this perpetual, constant have to raise profits no matter what, no matter how, to some degree. Or at least that's what I believed, but I've heard some stuff recently that started to make me really question that.
Yeah.
Where Marvel doesn't really seem to care about profits recently anymore.
Yeah, Marvel, well, it's Marvel Comics.
They sort of do.
They care, but they're not really beholden to the parent company. Because like I say, I don't think Disney cares. Like as long as the comics aren't rocking the boat, they're not interfering with the movies or the toys or the cartoons or any of that stuff.
Right.
That's a whole other kettle of fish. And that's one of the reasons why when you look at the comics, they don't tie in a great deal with like the movies and stuff.
Right, yes.
They'll change characters to look more like whoever's playing the character in the movie, but the stories don't reflect the film at all. They don't really mess with the back. They're kind of, a lot of them are all over the map.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the weirdest part to me anyway. They don't seem to have any interest in actually making the comics reflect the movies. Like, they don't seem to be doing what would be necessary to bring that movie-watching audience into reading the comics. They seem to, like, be perfectly happy keeping them separate. So, so right now Captain America is a Nazi. Or Hydra, or whatever. He's basically a Nazi at this point. And apparently always was, and this was his secret, like, Nazi thing or whatever. We'll talk about that in another show. The key point is that when the parent has a kid who loves Captain America comics and walks into a comic shop and says, "Hey, do you have any Captain America books that my 2-year-old daughter can read, or whatever, or that my 5-year-old daughter can read?" The comic shop owner gets to say, "Well, no, we don't." I mean, maybe they could point them towards some old graphic novels or the old collections, but most of those are often in a style that wouldn't appeal to a young audience looking for stuff that's kind of tied into the movies. I mean, it's literally like they just don't care. They're so busy trying to. I don't even know what they're trying to do. I mean, Marvel just moved out to LA. They're not even in New York anymore. They moved out just like a year or so to LA. They literally stopped all their books while they were doing it, and then they've restarted them again. And apparently it didn't work out so well, and I've heard there's actually a whole new Crisis reboot coming next year.
Again, well,
Again, they seem to be doing it every like 2 years at this point. It's getting shorter and shorter between reboots because they just can't make it all work. Well, like it just isn't working for them.
Yeah, because their big problem, and it kind of ties in with what we're talking about with Japanese comics, is that here the comics don't bring in a new audience.
Yeah.
So they're basically playing to the same audience they've had since the 80s. Like literally the same people.
You would think that, but given the nature of a lot of the books they're putting out right now, I've begun to seriously doubt that.
Yeah, but there's a catch to that.
Okay.
And this is where, like we've been saying all along, the thing that kept the Japanese comic industry going was the huge variety of audience members.
Right.
Because that always meant whatever the big thing was, there was something else that the average reader could get a hold of that would appeal to them specifically. Mm-hmm. So when the big thing was no longer the big thing, you could look at one of these other things and go, well, what's popular? Basketball. Okay, slam dunk. And now slam dunk is just the biggest, craziest. It's everywhere for some reason. And you could, and we used to do that here because that was the advantage of the circulating audience, is that you knew 5 years from now I could completely redo Superman and nobody would bitch and moan because first off, there was no internet to bitch or moan on.
Yeah, true.
And secondly, most of the old fans had moved on, so it was totally new people coming in. Or if they were old fans, they had already come to accept that, every few years there's going to be a big change in style.
Yes.
There was no fanfare. It just happened every few years. What's happening now is they're at that point, like the 80s is like 30 years ago. So some of that audience is dead now. Like their audience is contracting. That's why nowadays a comic that sells 100,000 copies is a hit. Whereas back in like the 80s, a comic that sold under 250,000 was a joke that got canceled. It got canceled before the ink was dry on the paper kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
So what you're seeing now is they're starting to get to that point where they're a little nervous and they're looking, we need to bring in a new audience. But because they've been so insular for so long, because by the time the 90s hit, you only bought comic books at a comic book store.
Yes.
And fewer people would go in because that was like where dad and all his like weird old guy friends would hang around and argue about Batman. So the kids really didn't care to go in there. They're trying to come up with ways to get, and I'm doing finger quotes, the kids in, but they have no clue.
I agree with that one, yes.
And this is why you'll get these like weird piecemeal things. Like I know nowadays people complain that like Marvel and DC are going like way too social justice warrior and nobody cares and their comics are all just agenda and grrr. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think it's because you've got these like people sitting in office going, what are the kids into these days? Protesting and not having jobs, the lazy bastards. Do that. That's what our comics will be.
There's only one problem with your theory. Since Marvel moved out to LA, they hired a whole bunch of young writers.
I know, but the thing is, which young writers would they hire? They're going
a bunch of English school graduates from the look of it.
Yeah, well, they're going to hire the people they think are going to connect with the kids today. And
but they're not a bunch of. Well, my point is, they're not a bunch of old guys.
No,
they're a bunch of 20-somethings. The people, maybe 30-somethings.
The people making the books are. The people making the decisions are not.
That's a valid point.
And it's interesting because if you look just a few years before that, if you remember, DC caught flack for the opposite reason, because when they did their big 52 reboot, they went for the hitherto unheard of superhero fan audience of 14 to 25-year-old males. And then for some reason, all their books had like subliminal penises on their covers. But
that's a discussion for another show, Don. We're getting way off track here.
It is, but they went ultra macho and they were all like, all the dudes were like big and grr and all the females were half naked and had triple D cups and stuff. And they caught flack for going the opposite way.
Right.
When what it is it's that desperation of trying to find that one specific, these are the kids today audience. And then that's kind of what tanks them because there aren't enough of them that you're going to bring them in. Whereas like I say, the Japanese comic industry could survive because you always had different audiences that you could move to the front.
Mm-hmm.
When in the 2000s they started doing Shonen Jump monthly here in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the stories they ran, people would buy it for Naruto and Yu-Gi-Oh!
Mm-hmm.
But then they would always throw in at least 2 other stories that were absolutely nothing like anything else in the book.
Mm.
So they would throw in a comedy and a soap opera comic.
Huh. Okay.
And if you remember in the early aughts, when the Japanese stuff took off here, everything took off.
Right.
You could buy the horror comics, you could buy new, you could buy old, you could buy boy comics and girl comics and drama comics and action comics. And it was because I think they did the El Slicko thing is they brought the kids in, and like I've said all along, because it wasn't a comic book, it was manga.
Mm-hmm.
Comic book is what Dad and his sweaty friends complain about at that weird store downtown.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the kids could get into it because it was something quote unquote new. It was their own thing. And then they exposed them to a variety. So you could hook those different audiences.
Right.
And then that's what ended up happening. And then here in North America, you got weird cross-pollination because you look at something like Bleach or Naruto.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those comics in North America, when they came out, had 40% female fans.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
And they're action comics, and we could never pull that off. Like your Marvels, your DCs, at best would have like 10% female readership, maybe 15.
Yep.
But it was in part because you do this like weekly book. It had something everybody liked. It was accessible because it was $5
mm-hmm.
for like a 250 to 300 page book, and even if you count the previews and that as ads, that's still like 200 pages of comic.
Yeah, Shonen Jump America was a great deal.
It was.
It really was. Yeah.
So you would buy it. You could buy it for one story because you're getting like 40 pages of that one story for $5. Mm-hmm. Whereas an American comic was comparably priced and is only like 22 to 24 pages a story.
Yeah, I know. That was crazy.
Mm-hmm. And then you've bought this thing. There's all these other stories. You're just going to read it because it's there.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody, not going to read that. I'm just going to purposefully flip right over that. You get exposed to new stuff. They found hitherto unheard of audiences, and that's why in the 2000s that took off here.
Yeah, yeah. It made a huge deal. And that's one of those things that Marvel and DC just have never managed to pull off. I do remember they have tried a few times in their histories to pull off something that was Shonen Jump-like.
Yeah.
But they never managed to do it. They could never manage to get that audience to cross-pollinate and to buy a book that was a whole bunch of serial stories running at the same time.
Yeah, I think though the two of them did have up period because I think in the Silver Age, DC did a better job at having mass appeal.
Right.
And I think in the Bronze Age, Marvel kind of had a better luck at doing that, but they cheated by getting Star Wars.
Right.
Because Star Wars kind of rejuvenated the North American comic industry.
Right.
Somebody wrote an article about that we could link to.
Okay, yep.
And
do that.
And if you remember at that point, late 70s, Marvel started doing more science fiction-y stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like they had the tie-ins, they did Godzilla, that was before Star Wars, but then they did Shogun Warriors, they had Micronauts. Micronauts was another big hit.
Dude, we will talk about that in the Marvel episode, okay?
We're doing a Marvel
let's get
episode.
back on the Japanese track. Yeah, we really should do a Marvel Comics episode. But we'll get there. Maybe we can get Stan Lee to come on. That would be awesome. I don't think it's going to happen, but we can try. So we do have mutual friends, so maybe we could pull that off. We'll see.
Dun dun.
Well, mutual guests, I should say. But anyway,
we'll get there.
We'll get there eventually.
But
we're coming for you, Stan. Hang in there. All right. So,
but anyway,
all right, so we got the aughts.
Yep.
Okay, in Japan.
And where I think, like I say, marketing takes over. The comics are contracting.
Yep.
The audience is contracting a little bit. I think then you get into the teens.
Right. Yep.
Or is there anything from the aughts you think needs to be added?
No, I think so, because the aughts were basically dominated by what we've talked about.
Yeah.
The Shonen Fight formula, the Shonen Fight formula, the kids collecting stuff formula. Yeah, it's kind of mostly it, actually. It's still there. I mean, Death Note comes out, it's a big influence, but and there are some Death Note copies that come out. In fact, you can still see psychological battle manga today, actually. There's still a bunch of them. Most of them don't get translated, but I have read a few fan translations of different ones. And yeah, they're still ultimately variations on the Hikaru no Go Death Note approach.
Yeah. And yeah, the other thing with the Dragon Ball Z thing taking over is that it becomes the formula for all comics.
Yes.
Young, old, male, female, that becomes what a comic book is.
Exactly. Okay, so the creators of Death Note decide to do a comic called Bakuman, which is about two talented artists. Well, an artist and a writer. Moritaka Mashiro, an artist and aspiring writer. Akito Takagi, two ninth grade boys who decide to become manga artists. And it would run in Shonen Jump. Mm-hmm. And ironically enough, it's about two young manga artists who are determined to get their work into Shonen Jump. And a lot of the characters apparently in the comic are actual real Shonen Jump staff members or resemble them in one way or another. They're definitely based on a few people. And is a kind of expose/critique of the whole manga industry combined with a kind of how to do comics or a philosophy of manga.
Yeah.
Book in a lot of ways. It's not exactly a how-to, more of a philosophy of manga approach. And yeah, Bakuman again uses that shonen fight formula in a lot of ways. Like it's still using that the same formula. I would argue that Death Note used, just in a slightly different way. In fact, maybe even it's closer to Dragon Ball Z actually in some ways.
I think it is. One of the things about Bakuman that we've talked about, but I've never seen mentioned anywhere else. A lot of people think it's a how-to to get into doing comics in Japan. But we've talked before about how I think it's a shot at the industry. That Bakuman is meant to highlight what a horrible, pandering, terrible, exploitive industry Japanese comic books really are.
Right.
And we've talked about, because one of the things that you keep getting the editors and the head editors and the executives who are based on real people. You can tell who's a real person. The term that I've heard used in the past, I think it was on the Stupid Comics website, is whenever you see a character in a comic whose face is a little more facey than other characters, they're usually modeled on a real person.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that was
face is a little more realistic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was the term that I've seen you, and you can see it in Bakuman, that every now and then some of the executives, they look like portraits.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the weird thing is they're always espousing these theories about, like, one of the ones that comes up early on when they talk about publishing, the chief editor, remember, he goes, manga just has to be good and then it will sell. And then you get like 80 pages showing how you can game the system to make your comic the number one comic, even if it sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, there are ways to game the system, because we haven't talked about this, I don't think, even though we've talked about Shonen Jump a lot, about how Shonen Jump is literally a giant popularity contest. Yeah. Every issue of Shonen Jump, and I don't know how far back this goes, but I'm guessing well into the early 80s, if not into the 70s, probably. Every issue of Shonen Jump comes with a card, postcard built into it, that you can basically check off what your favorite titles were from that book and send it in. And it's their way of getting feedback from the readers, and then that feedback is compiled, and they use that to help determine what the order of the stories in the book is going to be.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the weird things about Shonen Jump is the more forward it is in the rankings, the more popular that book is, and vice versa. So you can literally see in the lineup how popular different books are, and which is the most popular and which isn't the most popular.
Yeah.
I think there might be a little bit of variation in there, but I think they talk about that in Bakuman, where that's not 100% true, but unofficially that's the case.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because the stories at the front usually get the color pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's expensive, and then which is weird, because when they did them here, the monthly Shonen Jump here, it was always the new story, which was usually the more experimental one, that got the front spot.
Makes sense. But good, they were trying to get people exposed to new things, right?
Yep.
And everything. But they wanted people to try stuff, and they didn't want it to be buried in.
Yeah.
And ignored. But generally speaking, yeah, so Shonen Jump is, as Bakuman reveals, a bit of a complicated creature.
Yeah.
In many ways. And it can be gamed. You can actually come up with different approaches to boost your popularity. And I imagine most of those techniques are still being used to this very day by many artists.
Yep.
Including probably the ones who created Bakuman at that time.
Because Bakuman does the weird thing, too, of to anybody who reads it, and I do recommend reading it, it's a really good comic, is that when you meet the other cartoonists, they have a tendency to draw them and design them in the style of whatever kind of comic they draw.
Yes.
And that's something. There's also there's a part near the end, I don't know if this is official or not, but we've talked about it too, that there's basically a guy who's one of the cartoonists that comes in. He represents the American way of doing comic books. He's basically Marvel and DC.
Yes, yeah.
And I that can't be like accidental. And neither can like the results of that, I guess, is how you'd put that.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to discuss Bakuman because our audience hasn't read it, and we don't want to spoil it for them. But Bakuman, actually, if you really want to understand what the relatively current, because it's now a number of years old, manga industry is actually like, go read Bakuman.
Yeah, go read all of them for next week. We'll be talking about it next week. There'll be a test.
There'll be a test, exactly. Get out, go get those issues of Bakuman. There's only 20 volumes of it.
Yeah.
And there's another thing we actually didn't really discuss too much, actually. And I think we actually should mention that. Japanese comics, since I'm not actually sure where it started. I think it started in the 70s, but it might be the 80s. They began collecting them. Now, we referenced in the 1950s, they had what they called the Red Book collections. I remember talking about that. So they've been collecting them for a very long time, but at a certain point, these little trade paperback books started coming out of the comics. And they're basically 8 to 10 chapters of the story per volume.
Yeah.
And that's another thing, that pretty much all Japanese comics, to one degree or another, are structured with the plan to release them in these volumes. So this is why every 8 or 9 chapters or so, there's going to be a cliffhanger. Or there's going to be some major thing happen, because they want you to come back and read the next volume.
Yeah.
And that influences things. Like, Japanese story arcs tend to take place in blocks of 8.
Yeah.
For that very reason. Some story arcs will run over many, many volumes. But even within them, you'll find that there'll always be the biggest twist about chapter 8. And that's because that's meant to be that's the cliffhanger for them to get you to come back. Yeah,
I think that's a little new. I think that was a 70s thing. Like, they collect them. I've seen like Astro Boy collections from like the 60s.
Right.
So they weren't the Tankobon, the little paperback looking ones. They were big. They looked like the weekly books. But what you found, the earliest Japanese stuff tended to be written like how a lot of European comics are done today. That they're sort of written in chapters.
Right.
And then once you get to the end of this chapter, that's the end. The next one might continue, it might not. And they weren't originally worried about the compilations. because a lot of the stories would be kind of, like I said, semi-connected. Like you can read an Astro Boy story and then read the next one and it doesn't have anything to do with the first one you read, even if it's the one that follows.
Right.
Except for certain watershed ones where they'll introduce a character or something, and then, but it's more semi-serial. When you got to like the Gekiga era, you started getting actual stories, and I think by the 70s there was that look of the idea that you'd be collecting them.
Yes.
And it was also the idea that what they have in Japan that we didn't here was because these books would be in print for a while, you didn't constantly rehash stuff. And if you did a reboot, it was usually like a Total Cold reboot.
Yep.
Oh, this story just takes place in 100 years from the last one did, just because, fuck you, that's why. And it wasn't like, it was kind of like what we did here with like the Marvels and the DCs up until the 80s.
Right.
But everything, you started having that idea that it's all a continuing story, that there are events and consequence, because these books will just constantly be in print.
Yeah. Makes sense. And that's the thing, right? As I can say from living over there, and that you have kids that are, in their like 10, 11, 12 years old, reading comics from 30, 40 years ago. Because they can still find them on the shelf.
Yeah.
Actually, you have older than that because you've got kids that are like 10 years old reading Tezuka. Reading like early Tezuka.
Yeah.
And they're still available. And so they'll find them on the shelf. It's not unusual for kids in 2017 in Japan and Taiwan and Korea to be well versed in 80s comic books, in the popular 80s comics, because they can find them at their comic book cafes or their rental stores or whatever, or online these days.
Yep.
I mean, they can find that stuff really easy, and they read it.
Yep.
They can. There's a whole history of these books, and so a lot of them, like, they're still in print. Like Tankobon from the 1980s are still in print. As long as they sell, they're just going to keep them around.
Yep, and that's one of the reasons why, if you look up stats, you'll see like a Japanese comic that sold 150 million copies.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't do that in like 1 week. It's because they're on the 50th printing of the collection.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. When you see the Japanese comics numbers, you're generally looking at the Tankobon collections. You're looking at the graphic novel collections there, and so it's multiplied by the fact that something like One Piece has like 80 volumes, and then those are all selling every week. Like, people are buying maybe not all 80 at the same time, but kids are still buying them today, and they're going through, and it's been running for 20 years, and so that's why One Piece, I think, is up in the. It's definitely over 100 million. I think it might be in the 200 million range.
Yeah, I think it's like 150 or two. It's craziness. No, I got your numbers here from 2006.
Okay.
The total circulation for One Piece, which at this point, volume 45 is the most recent,
right, is
130 million copies. Volume 45 itself sold 2,250,000 copies.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which is, and if anybody out there wants to be horrified, if you're an American comic fan, the little Tankobon collections are about 200 pages. That's about a year's worth of a Marvel comic.
Yeah, it is.
Each one of those, so that's One Piece at this point was up to the equivalent of 45 years of a Marvel comic.
Yep, and by the way, they're releasing a new one every 2 months, give or take.
Yeah,
that's about 2 months worth of actual printed stories, and that's it's impressive. It really is. That's an understatement about just how many copies these comics sell. But it's easy to forget that there are 120 million people in Japan.
Yeah,
and a lot of them read comics.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. They grow up reading comics. And so, all right, so let's get into the teens.
Okay.
All right, so what's happened in the teens? Well, a few years ago, Bleach ended.
Yeah.
Then Naruto ended about 2 years or so ago. And One Piece is still going strong, of course, as it will probably be until like the mid to late 2020s, as long as the author doesn't die, God forbid.
He died 12 years ago. They replaced him with an android.
Well, yeah, probably his first assistant would probably continue with an outline or something. It would probably still be pretty good. But the key point is so the industry right now is in a little bit of a state of chaos. As far as I can tell, no real other books have risen up to replace the big three. And maybe that's not a bad thing, actually. I mean, as we said, One Piece is still running. There is a Naruto sequel called Boruto running, but I don't think it's anywhere near as popular. It's running only in one of the monthly shonen magazines. There's a... what is it? There's another series that popped up in Naruto's spot called My Hero Academia.
Okay, yeah.
That's been running for a while, which is a teen superhero one. It's popular, but not mega popular, from what I've been able to tell. It looks like it's kind of their number 2 story, I think, at this point in Shonen Jump. People can write in and correct me if you're actually reading it. But I think that My Hero Academia is kind of the number 2 at this point. And then there's a bunch of other ones that are running, but, in a way this might be good. And the reason I say that is this. Those 3, by being such mega hits, were kind of stealing all the oxygen from the room, so to speak.
Right.
Now, with just One Piece in the game, there's room for other ones to rise up again. Like, there are now 2 other spots that other titles can rise up into, like My Hero Academia, for example, or something that can replace it if, My Hero Academia starts waning, so to speak.
Yeah.
But there's more experimentation, I suspect, going on right now. Like, for example, one of the main titles in Shonen Jump right now is this thing called Robot X Laser Beam.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which is a golfing manga.
Yeah.
But I'm willing to bet, I haven't read it, but I have a funny feeling that if I do actually check, I will probably discover that it's basically still following the Dragon Ball Shonen Fight formula. It's just a golfing manga version of it. That's my guess. I might be wrong, not sure. But I suspect that, and I mean, there seem to be trying sports. They seem to be trying a whole bunch of different stuff now. So it's no longer just, copies of the big 3. There seems to be a lot more variety because they're looking for the next big thing at the moment. Yeah,
there's kind of 2 things that shape Japanese comics now. The big one is, oh my God, Naruto's over, we're gonna lose our jobs, what do you do now? And I think what you're seeing, the audience is contracted, sales are down, the 2 of the big 3 are basically done. What you're getting is diffusion. That there is a lot more experimentation because there are a lot more holes in the audience now. That there's a lot of people who weren't getting anything they were interested in.
Right.
And now that the 3 big Dragon Ball Z clones are kind of dying off, it does, like you were saying, it leaves that spot open that other things can kind of creep in.
Right.
Because we were talking about this before we started recording. A lot of the Japanese comics that I like personally have come out in like the last 10 years. And I think it's because for a long time, like when you got to the 90s and comics started getting kidified again, and I think partly because, like we said, Pokemon, we can sell kids stuff. Oh man, that's great. And then everything kind of got aimed at that audience. Everything got aimed at the marketing. You're starting to see stories being produced to produce a story now.
Right.
And you're starting to see, experimentation reaching out to different audiences. You're seeing there's nostalgia starting to kick in.
Yeah.
And they're being nostalgic for the 80s, which is actually a big boom.
Yep.
You can see that especially with the animation. The animation's getting more experimental.
That makes sense. Well, they're also, we haven't talked about this because it's not relevant exactly to this discussion, but Japan has been undergoing for, I guess, almost the last 10 years, a huge animation boom.
Yeah.
Where they have a whole bunch of new channels pop up, and there's been a huge demand for content. And so what they've been doing is they've been animating everything they can get their mitts on, pretty much. So a lot of old stuff has suddenly gotten new animated releases or a new animated reboot or all sorts of stuff's been going on just because they need this animated content for their audiences.
And oh, go ahead.
And as an end result, they... I forgot what I was going to say. Go on.
Oh, well, I was going to say, you're right, and they're all starting to reach further afield.
Yes.
The best example I can think of is One Punch Man. That was basically a web comic.
Yeah, it was. Yep.
And then...
Still is.
Yeah, but it got picked up by one of the bigger companies. They slapped on one of their more popular, more talented artists to give it more... the more graphic appeal, I guess you'd say, over the original. And then that becomes like a big animated thing, and then that's starting to pick up.
Yes, definitely.
But that's the kind of thing, like, say, 10 years prior, they wouldn't have done, because they would just look in-house and say, more Dragon Ball. Just do more... Which One Punch Man is almost a parody of that, because it's the guy who powered up to the point he literally cannot power up anymore.
Right, yeah, that's true. And again, yeah, you're right, that's more experimental. It's trying something different, trying something new. And the Japanese are doing that at the moment. I think also the internet has made a big difference as well.
Yep.
Just as Comiket caused a huge variety of new stuff to start popping out. And of course there were lots of mini Comikets all throughout Japan once the whole fanzine market started to take off. The internet and webcomics in Japan has of course also made a huge change to the market.
Yeah.
There's much more variety. It's created competition, of course, for the actual mainstream industry, so it's hurt their sales, among other things,
right.
And it has, apparently. But at the same time, you're right, we're seeing a lot more different stuff come out.
Yeah.
And they have been trying to create online comic websites where you can go for new comics each week and everything as well. I don't think they've been entirely successful, but I might be wrong about that. I don't know what the current state of like Shonen Jump Online is or anything like that, or what they've exactly been doing.
I think it gets like about 250,000 like hits per book a week.
Well, that's not bad.
Yeah, I
mean, it's not great, but it's not bad.
Yeah, it's not comparable to the print stuff, but I do think it's not doing bad at all. Yeah.
And it will hopefully just continue to go up.
Yeah.
As time goes on. I'm honestly hoping for that.
Yeah. And hell, we've had not one but two new Go Nagais in the last decade.
Yeah, everyone's having their resurgence, even Go Nagai.
No, I mean like two new equivalents to Go Nagai.
Oh, okay. Well, he's been doing new stuff too, but okay, what do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking of Kigitsu Kashihisha.
Okay, who does what?
Frankenfran.
Oh, yes, he was awesome.
And everybody's hero, Boichi.
Boichi is also awesome. Actually, Boichi, interestingly enough, I just noticed this. Boichi has stuff running in Shonen Jump.
Which is kind of...
he's got I think it's Dr. Stone?
Yeah, that's the one where everybody gets turned into statues.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but that's kind of interesting. I should check that out, actually.
It doesn't have the same level of TNA that every single other thing he ever did does.
Well, no, I imagine it doesn't.
He is a master of... Just when you think he can't cram another ass shot in, it's like, nope, there he did. The man is a genius. So...
Right. Okay. Yep. Well, he's Boichi, yeah, but Boichi is a pretty impressive dude. I will say that. And so, yeah, new stuff. They are still trying new stuff. The manga industry is still far from dead.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's as healthy as perhaps we'd want, or perhaps as they'd want. But I'd still say, compared to the North American comic industry, it's going strong.
Yeah, I think artistically it's very healthy. It's just sales-wise, it's not as healthy as the execs would like. Right.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And so hopefully it will have a long life ahead of it.
It almost didn't, because that was one of the other things in the teams that sort of had people a little concerned.
Oh?
Bill 156.
What's Bill 156?
Remember, that was their version of Seduction of the Innocent.
Oh, right. Yeah, are you talking about the one where the super censorship bill that they released but it's only
for Tokyo? Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the old trick, right? Where Tokyo is the largest manga market, so if you release a censorship bill for Tokyo, it's going to affect all of Japan.
Yeah.
And this is something that has happened on a regular basis. I mean, slowly the amount of let's be honest, sex and fan service and that especially in shonen manga has actually decreased over the last, like, say 20 years a lot.
Yeah.
Compared to where it was. And now, mind you, some of it did transfer off into other comics. I mean, there's other stuff that still does have a fair amount of fan service.
Mm-hmm.
But in the shonen element, yeah, they stopped using TNA, and a lot of that is the result of, like, concerned parents groups and other groups that they're just trying to keep from annoying, so to speak, and have them protesting. And things like, Tokyo's governor/mayor, who crusaded to basically remove pretty much fan service from Japanese comic books, basically, and has at least partly succeeded.
See, I don't know if I don't think it did.
Okay.
I think, again, what happened when it came out is it was the safe money, because now you look like a hero. Mm-hmm. But by the early, teens, most of the mainstream stuff had been kidified again.
Right.
Because it was all about selling stuff to kids that they could then fight with. And I don't think it exactly took off, because if you look at the books that started getting popular after that,
mm-hmm.
It was after that you had, Frank and Fran come out. You had everything Boichi ever did. You had stuff that was starting to get a little attention, like Hell's Angels or Lives, which I know you guys hated, but I liked.
Right.
Even something like One Punch Man. One Punch Man has, every now and then, they'll throw in just, a crazy amount of TNA.
That's true.
And it seems like, again, it was that thing where the industry in Japan doesn't kowtow to the concerned citizens. That the bill comes out, everybody looks like a hero, the industry had already been kidified. When they decided, nope, time to show cleavage again, all of that gets ignored.
Right, yeah. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do think, though, that there was a point where they were probably headed towards, let's just say a ton more TNA, and maybe even getting worse. And then, because of the concerned citizens, they started backing off. I mean, I have heard stories of, for example, stuff being published in, say, Shonen Jump, for example, and then when the Takabon version comes out, it's been photoshopped and toned down. That the panties are suddenly a lot bigger, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the reverse of the stuff that happens with DVDs here.
Yeah.
Where they release the stuff that wasn't toned down on the DVDs. The Tankobon usually end up actually being the toned down versions, because it's for a mass market. And usually they got flack the first time it came out, so like, okay, fine. So her panties are now much bigger, or she's actually wearing, shorts or something now, that kind of thing. Because it's almost always just TNA.
Yeah, I can kind of, but like I say, I don't know if that's exactly because of the complaining, or if they're using the complaining as the meter stick because they are trying to sneak in a younger audience. In a lot of ways, it's like the Senate subcommittee hearings.
Right.
Because people don't realize that the comics code that we had because of that didn't come from the U.S. government.
Right.
That
it came from within the industry.
Yeah, the 54 subcommittee hearings said, no, this is complete crap. Comics are just like anything else. They don't make you into a juvenile delinquent. Get out of our office. But the industry made the code. Now, people think the code was made specifically to take EC comics out, because they were by far the most popular books. And the code had specific things like, you can't have the word like horror or terror or crime in the title. And that was like Vault of Horror, Crypt of Terror, crime stories were like EC's top selling books. So people think it targeted that. And it's the same thing, this Bill 156. I remember when it came out, people thought was specifically tackling High School of the Dead.
Right.
That a lot of people, that they felt that specifically was the book that this thing was going after.
Right. Maybe. I could see that. Anyway, we're running low on time, so
Right.
let's wrap this puppy on up.
Mm-hmm.
So, any final thoughts then, Don, about manga? I guess we've kind of covered what's happening so far. I mean, if anything, based on the cycles that we've seen so far, okay, I should probably start with my own. If anything, based on the cycles we've seen so far, I would say that probably it's just a matter of time before another, Naruto or Bleach or whatever does actually appear. And, these periods of, it always follows the same cycle, right?
Yeah.
There's a period of experimentation, and eventually a few dominant types pop up, and they basically take over, and everyone just follows those for another decade or so until they don't work anymore. And then after that, there's another period of experimentation, and on the cycle goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for better or for worse, I think the industry will slowly continue to slip online more and more.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it won't be healthy. It just means that it will be more online because, every Japanese is now walking around with cell phones and such. So it'll be a Shonen Jump cell phone app, and you'll just basically read your Jump comics on that.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I think that's probably what's going to happen with, again, hopefully more and more experimentation.
Yeah.
For now, anyway.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. But and we'll definitely do our favorite manga episode as well. We talked about some of them obviously here, but I think there's a bunch of ones that definitely deserve more attention, but we definitely don't have time to talk about them today.
True.
And we'll talk about the anime industry in hopefully a slightly shorter episode sometime in the future.
That'll be next week where we cover the entire Japanese animation industry.
Dude, just shoot me now.
Get the coffee.
Okay. Anyways, folks, for those of you who have managed to get through all of this, thank you for listening. And we really appreciate it. And hopefully you've learned a few things or have learned to hate us, whichever. And please tune in next time when we'll talk about something much more interesting and maybe even have an actual guest on.
I don't know.
We'll see.
I don't know if you could find anything more interesting because I think what I'm hoping the big takeaway for anybody who listens to this that hates Japanese comics is it's not one thing. That, like, I always compare it to television. Like, if you were to watch The Horrible Housewives of Potemkin or whatever and think, all television sucks, you're generalizing too much.
Right.
That you can't,
Okay.
you can't really talk about Japanese comics because it's not one thing. It's everything.
Okay, I can see that. Okay, thanks for listening, folks, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Good luck.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.